Simon Dixon here, the week that repositioned the world. Let's go. Monday, we had the G7 meeting and we had surprises from Trump. Tuesday, we had the Bank of Japan and we had increases in rates and the Japan carry trade. Wednesday, we had Kev Warsh's first meeting at the Federal Reserve and the impossible tasks and the things he's going to be working on. On Thursday, we had an early announcement of the Iran-US deal. And on Friday, we were meant to have the signing, but we had the very large symbology of what happened in Versailles. We also had the unearthing of the problems with the Bitcoin Treasury companies and the financial industrial complex operation to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. Let's jump right in. Hey, Sovereign Wealth Builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. As always, we've got a ton of stuff to cover. In fact, there was one thing for every day this week. We're now on Friday, and this really was the week that the world got repositioned. We had a lot of stuff come together, whether it was the G7 meeting, whether it was the relationship between Iran, Israel, and US, whether it was central banks and changing policies, or whether it was Bitcoin treasury companies and the implosion of some of those. We're going to be going through all of it today. And in part one, we're going to be covering each of those events, the 5 events that repositioned the world that happened this week. And in part two, once we're done, we're going to be premiering an interview I did on BTC Sessions with Nathan. And really, we discuss who really won the Iran war. And clue, spoiler alert, it definitely wasn't the USA, but you might be a little bit surprised. So this may be one of the most consequential and important weeks of 2026. And I'm not just saying that to be hyperbolic, because it's been, we've been covering it each week on Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. But a bunch of it came together. I think I should be a Hollywood script writer. It seems like following the money allows you to write the scripts, and the scripts are really playing out. Thank you all for your comments on X from those people that recognized that we were able to get so far ahead. And while Zionists are melting down, and those that believe Israel is the sole force that rules the world are trying to figure out what's going to happen here, it really makes sense when you follow the money and you really think who won this. And so we're going to be reviewing the 5 events, and we're going to be analyzing it from our frame. And we're going to be covering the 5 major events. They all happened consecutively starting from Monday. So Monday was the kickstart of the G7 meeting. And then on Tuesday, we had the Bank of Japan increase rates as we were predicting. And then on Wednesday, we had the Federal Reserve, the first one with Kevin Warsh, where he kept rates unchanged as we were expecting. Then we had on Thursday, the Iran-US memorandum, which was signed prior to it was meant to be signed. And amongst all of this, we had Bitcoin treasury companies really defining and demonstrating how Jane Street, BlackRock strategy, and the general financial industrial complex of leverage is able to utilize these Bitcoin treasury companies as many of our long-term thesis. And it really was amazing. On Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live, we started covering what was happening with strategy very, very early when it was really unpopular, just like we were covering what would happen with Iran and Israel very, very early when it was really unpopular. But now it's becoming mainstream narrative. So we're starting to see more and more people realize what strategy in these Bitcoin treasury companies are. And now anyone can talk about it. But what we do here is we talk about it when everyone hates you. We have the hard talk where it's really early. Everyone hates you for everything you're saying. But then later it becomes okay and, kind of normalized, and more people are able to say it. And so we'll take the hit. As always, I'll take the hit. Why? Because I've been working on my sovereign strategy. I've been removing all the layers that mean that it's unacceptable for me to share things early because I've been removing all the subordination layers. And that's really what Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live is all about. Taking you from subordinated to sovereign. It's a spectrum. It's a journey. It takes a decade to put together a plan. But every day you have to ask yourself, am I more subordinated or am I more sovereign? Every week, was I more subordinated this week or more sovereign this week? Every year, am I more subordinated this year or more sovereign this year? And that's the spectrum that we unearth. And you're never going to be fully sovereign. We're all subordinated to something. But our job is to peel off the layers one by one so that we can journey through and we can make better decisions and we can have, a north guiding star anyway. Well, anyway, individually, none of these events would really seem that related. What's the G7 got to do with Bitcoin treasury companies? What's the Bank of Japan got to do with what's happening at G7? What's the regime change at the Fed got to do? But together, they all tell one story, and that's the story of following the money. And by following the money, we're able to remove ourselves from media manipulation and politicians that work for lobbies but pretend they work for us. So let's jump straight in. G7 event. Now, as G7 becomes less of a share of GDP relative to BRICS in a multipolar world, it's more interesting watching the narratives than the actual impact, because all of those leaders and even Trump saying, I'm in charge, and then knocking on Keir Starmer's shoulder, really is the layers of subordination, because they all work for the financial industrial complex and to lesser degrees the military or technical industrial complex. But they all have lobbies and they're all prostitutes for real power. And they all need you to believe that if only I change those people, or if only I believe in those people, then maybe everything will change. And guess what? Spoiler alert, it won't. The sooner you opt out, the sooner you realize, unless you can buy those politicians and you're part of the lobby, then you're not factored into the equation. You are the product. You are the collateralized debt obligation, or you are the power that needs to be subordinated into compliance and their power structure by either putting you and wrapping you in a public company, taking your business and giving you Silicon Valley funding, wrapping you up as a collateralized debt obligation, indoctrinating you into university lobby-funded narratives, making you subordinate to banks, whatever they need, pushing you into left and right divides, different identity politics, whatever they need to do to keep you distracted from reality. And our job is to have the hard talk so that you can have the hard talk with yourself, take a good look in the mirror, and get ready for all of these psyops that are happening around us. But anyway, I think the highlight, and even though I know there's an element of theatrics because we were predicting this for the last years, that I said there will be a day after the transitionary war, after the theatrical war, that you will see the regime change in Israel and a slow transition in narrative away from Trump, who was funded predominantly by the Gulf countries, turning on Israel, who was being who was funding him via Mariam Edelstein, but she was third in line. Above him was the banking Mellon dynasty, and above them was Elon Musk, the technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, with personal wealth via Jared Kushner's affinity partners that was funded by the Gulf countries. So there's the order. While publicly you were told Israel rules the world and everyone was looking at AIPAC, you had Gulf funding on top, Elon Musk and technical industrial complex underneath, Mellon family and financial industrial complex underneath that, and then finally military industrial complex and Mariam Edelstein via Israel First policies. That is the chaos that's needed to get the forever war continuation. But at the top, the Gulf with FIC and TIC want a regional stability plan. And so that's why we'd had this managed transition. And by following the money, we can check the flows and we can get ahead of the narrative. So anyway, there were a couple of comments at the G7 meeting. Firstly, Trump was trying to exert dominance over all the Europeans and other G7 countries. That's part of the Western Hemisphere becoming subordinate to FICMIC and TIC, escalating from the MIC side in Europe, and the decoupling with Japan that happened through the Japan carry trade, which would be Event 2. So Trump's Israel comments, what were they? Trump very publicly, in a rare moment, criticized Israel's Lebanon strategy. Now, remember, this is a mixed strategy. And so by having strategic tension through operations like Operation Gladio, you're able to create the justification and the narratives needed to justify war spending, which allows you to issue more debt in the bond market, get the American or the taxpayers to pay for it through inflation, and then redirect it through these laundering organizations like Israel back up into the companies that benefit from the laundering operation. And so Israel is performing that function, and strategic tension via IRGC and the Iranian Islamic Republic funding the different groups creates that strategic tension. Now, whether you engineer that strategy, who's on board to that, you just follow the game theory and the interests, and you can see how we got here. So the Lebanon strategy is part of that strategic tension. And by Trump exposing it, you get the plausible deniability, managed divorce strategy that I've been saying would come next, leading into the regime change, given that Netanyahu would have used his leverage in order to negotiate his exit, Trump making sure he doesn't go through the impeachments, and the financial incentives that had to have been set up to get there. And then you get a Gulf-aligned regime change within Israel ready for strategic acquisitions. But in order to do that, you need to give the thing that Trump would have got, given that effectively Iran very publicly won this war. And so Trump needs his narrative to take away, which is the divorce narrative away from Israel, so that the Q-Tods and MAGA-Tods, who are part of that PSYOP, get to say, oh, yeah, we're now taking on Israel after Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, Nick Fuentes, various others were given the traffic to expose Israel for what it is. And then you get that plausible deniability. So I'll give a little quote from Trump at the G7 meeting. He said, Israel has been fighting Lebanon for far too long. The second quote, you don't have to knock down an apartment house every time you are looking for somebody. So there was a whole lot more, and it was talking about Hezbollah and various other things. But this really was, Trump publicly showing the managed divorce narrative that led to, remember that I said, after this war, you need a transition. You need to reposition the neocon evangelical Christians, that's the Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, Nick Fuentes role, through media in order to decouple them from their belief around Israel, mainly focused on the boomers, the younger generation. The Gaza genocide was enough. The boomers, they seem to ignore the Gaza genocide, and there's still a lot more work to be done there. But you need to tackle that narrative. And we had a massive Zionist meltdown. We had the Ben Shapiros, we had the Mark Levins, we had the Laura Loomers, all melting down at what was actually signed because Iran won the war very publicly in terms of the theatrics here. So why is this important? Well, this happened just before the Iran deal was actually signed. And so you got the G7 comments, then you got the signing, and that very publicly symbolizes to world leaders that the American empire can no longer exert influence. This is the American empire's Suez Canal moment that happened in 1956 to the British Empire, when effectively the British Empire could no longer use its navy in order to defeat Egypt from privatizing the Suez Canal. That was the final transitionary phase after all the financial transactions had already happened, transitioning the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. World War I, Great Depression, after a pump, World War II, all of those events that led to the IMF, World Bank, trade all currencies against dollars, and dollars being tradable against gold, that built the military industrial complex through the bond market, pumped all that value into the stock market until eventually you asset strip the entire US, just like the Bank of England did with the British East India Company. Now you have BlackRock, Federal Reserve, massive national debt, asset stripping, and setting up the world empire while you extract as much value through fiscal dominance and currency revaluations that are happening right now. But anyway, this was just before the Iran deal was actually announced. So this is part of the managed divorce strategy. And this is a thesis that I've been putting together of what would happen after what I called the second round of the 12-day war. Obviously, this was 100 days, and they condensed about 5 years into about 3 months. But it's not really a divorce between America and Israel. It's a managed transition while thick and tick try to maintain as much as they can and negotiate into the different nodes of the Gulf countries in Iran and with China, while managing this, multipolar world transition. Really, it is a divorce between Washington, which is fully subordinate to lobbies. So, the nation state, the political side, and Netanyahu's strategy, which was alignment with military. So this is publicly part of that divorce strategy. You do the genocide, you release the Epstein files, you do the trade war that drives everyone to China, and then finally you get the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and then you take all those radicalized evangelical Christians that confuse Israel, the prophet, with Israel, the political country, and you make it where it's harder and harder then to justify any of the ethical considerations around this. So it's a big part of the de-radicalization process. But anyway, the alliance still survives to the extent it can, but rather than being a MIC node for the forever war, Israel becomes a thick node for regional stability, which sounds absolutely crazy. But in order to manage that transition, you get as much land as you can to negotiate for FIC before Israel is regime changed and then privatized and acquired by the Gulf countries in line with China's vision of the world, which requires normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so the alliance still survives, but is repackaged, rebuilt, and regime changed. But the strategy changes, as we've been predicting and looking for. Now, I think the leadership will change, and that leadership has to, right up until October, lean into the more radicalized Zionist vision of a post-US military-funded Israel. And so in order to maintain that transition, while in the background, they'll be funded predominantly by these GCC negotiations, they still need to maintain the radical Zionist outlook. At the same time, I think they're preparing, and I said in previous episodes, that Arachi is being framed for future leadership alongside Galavant and the Khamenei, son. And that was a continuation of his father's strategy of slowly moving towards a new strategy of integration based upon the relationship with China. And so you also need to groom J.D. Vance. So J.D. Vance was meant to get credit for Trump becoming very unpopular, J.D. Vance maintaining the agreement, Pakistan getting the name Islamabad Accords, but then signing in Versailles, which has symbolic meaning, which I'll be going through soon. And so J.D. Vance increasingly started to show frustration at Israel at the same time, while looking like he was the one that was pushing for peace. And who is JD Vance? He's Palantir's guy. So he's the tick guy. Now we'll see what happens on the co-option of the Democrat leadership. But my guess at this stage is that you get Trump. And remember what I said during the Biden thing. I said Trump will be elected because he was chosen to go to war with Iran. Then after Trump, you may most likely get JD Vance, which is a tick guy. That builds out the police and surveillance state and the control grids because he's Palantir funded, Peter Thiel's guy. And then you get a far movement towards the left, where essentially you can have civil unrest and maybe a switch back to Democrat to get people believing, all that shit that happened, that was because of the far right Republicans. And now we need to move more to the left again. And you get people buying into that. That's probably what the next two election cycles, 2028 and 2032, look like. That's my current hypothesis. We'll adjust that as more financial information becomes available. We'll be looking at the lobbies that fund JD Vance moving into these campaigns. But anyway, you can see that JD Vance is being groomed for that role. And in a tick-dominated world, Trump was aligned with Fick, Biden was aligned with Mick, and JD Vance is aligned with Tick. So there's really, trying to accelerate the tension between Washington and the current Israeli leadership is what I was predicting and what we started to see at the G7 meeting and throughout this whole week. So there was a massive narrative shift before the actual policy shift. Now, I will be looking out for that integration between the Israeli intelligence and the Israeli army and the American army. That may be a few things. I discussed that in my recent interview on Capital Cosm. I haven't really committed to my full analysis on it right now. It may just be one of those bills that's designed to create tension, distract people because it will never get through. It may also be actually more reflective of what the reality of the relationship between the MIC is there. And so what happens is I gave the example of the Silicon Shield on Danny's Capital Cosm interview that I premiered on my YouTube channel yesterday. And I gave the example of, with Taiwan, both China and the TIC know that they're going to be independent, or they're going to need to be chip independent. So you need TIC infrastructure in both China and America. They can't be both dependent upon Taiwan. And so by everybody knowing that the Silicon Shield, as it's called, the agreement that protected Taiwan because everyone needed chips, all the empires needed chips, so no one could invade or disrupt. But by knowing that America is moving towards chip independence through the CHIPS Act and TSMC building manufacturing capacity in Arizona, and at the same time knowing that China's going chip independent through the Huawei infrastructure building that's happening there, you know that those in Taiwan that know the future of our industry is integration with China will kind of lean into helping China become chip independent. Whereas those that are anti-China, but more American Western aligned, they are brain drained into Arizona and they build the chip factories and they kind of help America get the edge. But through a natural selection, you separate when none of the value maintains in the Silicon Shield, because eventually China and America are going to be chip independent, but they're working together through this TIC global control grid, which is why you had the meeting between the TIC executives, the FIC executives, and Xi Jinping and the CCP. By the way, I say CCP because most people in China, it's CPC, but people know CCP in the West, so I say that, even though I know it's a Western term. But we could say CPC to be more politically correct if everyone wants. This is what I think it might result of that. But I'll keep reviewing. It might be part of a civil unrest campaign. It might be part of something, a distraction campaign that has no way to get through. Or it might actually be to separate Mossad, CIA, choosing which side they're going to be going down as Israel gets acquired into the Gulf and becomes part of West Asia as well through its integration and regime change. But anyway, the narrative shift happens before the policy shift. So anyway, what did we get at G7? Well, there was a lot of talk around Lebanon, Israel, US relationship, Ukraine, Russia, energy, artificial intelligence, regulations, all the things, all the World Economic Forum agendas. Remember, regulations are moats for transnational capital and the large multinational corporations. They pretend that they don't want regulations. Regulations is what protects large corporate interests from small business. And so the moats are being built around regulations. We're getting to that movement towards digital ID with using the internet to protect our children. You have to verify you're 16, all those different things that are being beta tested. But anyway, my MIC compensation theory, I think, became very apparent at the G7 meeting. I think it was pretty vindicated, which is that the Iran deal that was signed after these different, condemning of Israel from the US, it reduces Middle Eastern war opportunities because now you have to move to defense, sales, which are significantly less profitable than forever was. And so MIC, doesn't simply lose revenue. I've always said that you need to have a police and surveillance state in America and Europe, and you need more war in Europe. And so the G7 was simultaneously signaling that the Ukraine funding, they need more funding for Ukraine. They probably want to remove release the sanction money. You had more EU sanctions, more NATO escalations, and more Russian sanctions. That's signaling that there's significantly more money, as I've always said, and a longer term approach with the Russia-Ukraine war. And so, we're seeing more of the European manufacturing base that was destroyed for building cars and various other things is resurfacing as a European military industrial complex. And so we're starting to see more IPOs around Germany, military complexes and European. We saw the narrative of Europe going more independent. They're all controlled by the same BlackRock ETF flows. We're going to see, there was more narrative around needing to spend more on military, more NATO expansion at the G7 meeting, more Middle East becoming, a financial industrial complex by signing the MOU and various other things and the opportunity. But effectively, the Middle East is now FIC opportunity, negotiating with, power structures in the region. And Europe is now more of an opportunity for MIC as well. And this has been our long-term thesis, and that's how you split the world up into multipolarity. But there is the Lebanon holdout clause, which is why I thought it's interesting that Trump decided to focus on Hezbollah and Lebanon while making Israel and that divorce narrative. Because the deal is now signed, but they've got the holdout clause. If you go back to, I think it was when on my blog, simondixon.com, I gave like 8-9 weeks where I was covering just the Iran war. And I think it was week 4 or week 5 on my blog where I said Lebanon would be the holdout clause. You need that because once you've got the MOU signed and then you go into final term sheet, you need an escalation clause. And eventually we need to move towards the Lebanon Hezbollah integration and political process. And so you need some kind of managed transition to go from one side to the other side, but they're all connected. If Iran is no longer going to be following the resistance strategy, but testing through different, slow milestones, a transition to regional integration. And so Lebanon is the holdout clause. The deal is now signed. The final settlement is not signed, though. So we've gone from letter of intent, which was the early negotiations, to memorandum of understanding, which is we're all on the same page here, and we publicly communicated it with a PR strategy, to final terms, which are going to take another 60 days. But you still need to have, leverage in those negotiations of making people believe that this could still escalate toward World War III. And so Lebanon is the leverage point that has essentially been set up. So what does it mean? It means Israel hasn't signed the deal. Everyone believes, or many people believe, Israel rules the world and they're autonomous. And so they could escalate towards Lebanon. That accentuates the divorce narrative and plausible deniability, while simultaneously being able to negotiate a land grab in Lebanon that then leads to the next, land for settlement, which will be more leverage for FIC rather than the forever war Greater Israel project for MIC. That's the change. And so Israel can escalate. And what happens when Israel escalates? What they tend to do is they always go after civilian targets. And so when they go after civilian targets, that inspires a reaction with a narrative from the resistance, which, by the way, is genuine. I'm not saying everyone's, these are higher level infiltrations, but the genuine grievances and deaths, they're real. Mick doesn't care about those things. And then Iran can react through Hezbollah, but Washington effectively can stay out. And so they get the ability to say, right, US doesn't get involved, which is what I think happens from here. But we know nothing happens in Israel without, Western MIC. I mean, CIA, Mossad, these are one thing, effectively. And nothing can happen without them. And even Trump reiterated, and J.D. Vance reiterated, all these weapons are made with American hands, which has surveillance built into them and control built into them. And they were paid for with American taxpayer money. That's real. Or, that is the money laundering operation exposed. And the rest of the world, at the geopolitical leadership level, they now understand the order's changing. Everyone change your strategy accordingly. And that's why you have to have these theatrical symbols as well. But anyway, the Washington basically, I think, will be less willing to be involved, which means you can have Israel go after Hezbollah retaliate, and you can have Iran green lighted to retaliate on Israel. What's the purpose of that? So you can simultaneously integrate Hezbollah into the Lebanese process as the need for resistance diminishes. Israel gets strategically targeted for rebuild contracts and acquisition into the Gulf corridor. And Iran gets its preservation narrative as this goes through a massive change. And we already saw, the Ayatollah came out and said, look, I didn't want to do this, but I trust Galiband and Arachi and, the reformist party and the Democratic Party within Iran in order to sign this MOU and give this a chance. So this is how you preserve, the change without an uprising, even though we're starting to get signs of dissatisfaction in the political process within Iran, but nothing that leads to a full-blown coup. And it won't be backed by external forces in order to disrupt, just like we've always had Mossad, CIA, MI6, and Operation Ajax in the past. So anyway, Hezbollah may be weakened before integration, or they may get a position of strength depending on what's, for negotiating into the Lebanese process. But Israel may also be weakened through the retaliation before integration as well. And both become easier to absorb basically into the GCC BRICS allegiance with Iran, and the new architecture that involves the exit of US and the refactoring of Israel from MIC node to FIC node. And so really, that's what we got to watch. And I will be watching very closely around the different elements of the deal. But the key question is with Lebanon will be the final battlefield before integration. Personally, I think it will. And if you look at the 14 points of the deal that have now been published, we'll go through that in further events. They're all around defining the new world order based upon financial regional investment contracts. And so that's what I got from the G7 meeting. I think it vindicated what we've been our long-term thesis of directionally where this is going. So now let's jump into what happened on Tuesday. That was Monday when the G7 meeting kicked off. On Tuesday, event 2, we had the Bank of Japan, which did a rate increase towards 1%. So the Bank of Japan raises rates to 1%. This is the highest that they've ever been, since in this post-World War II order, prior to the quantitative easing being invented and the massive correction in the markets that turned Japan into zombie land, where it had to offer free money to any speculator that wanted to borrow it for free. And then that created the Japan carry trade, which allowed people to hedge out the risk and use the Bank of Japan as a piggy bank with the Federal Reserve. And then the Fed could then push that into hedge funds. We could then do the basis trade where they lever up the US treasuries into the kilter, and Japan becomes the largest foreign holder of US treasuries, which is the Japan carry trade. At the same time, you have the petrodollar and the euro dollar, which I've talked about. But if you're managing a transition away from America being the global hegemon, you break the Japan carry trade, you change the euro dollar makeup, and you also break the petrodollar. So why this matters? Well, Japan has been basically one of the final sources of cheap liquidity that exists out there. So this needs to be managed very, very carefully. And so by slowly increasing rates, you break that Japan carry trade and you manage the liquidity away into domestic purchases. And so the American, the American and the FIC become the purchasers. They receive the yield, but you don't want to break the bond market. At the same time, you know that eventually when something breaks, you socialize the losses, privatize the gains, and the Fed will be able to manage those yields and take on the balance sheet. And so the global carry trade, is dependent upon Japan at the moment, i.e. the Bank of Japan. And if you break that, then Japan goes more eastwards, and liquidity drives effectively bond prices. So you've got to be very careful. A lot of the equities, the Bank of Japan owns significant equities. It owns its own debt as well. Because it is an exporter, and that exporter has massive trade surplus, and it invests that in bonds and US treasuries and US equities, as does the petrodollar and the Gulf countries as well. So that also has an impact in currencies, the demand for the dollar, the process of weakening the Japanese yen, the process of how you manage the Chinese yuan, which is effectively they want a weaker currency. They don't want to be world reserve currency, but they want gold reserves that maintains this value so that they can strategically weaken it. With the Japanese yen, it is deeply dependent between a partnership between the Bank of Japan and the FX swap lines, and the Federal Reserve, managed via the Bank for International Settlements as well. And so in the currency side, that's a very important relationship. Japan needs to purchase its energy and its oil. It is very important in the AI trade as well, and the robotics trade. And all of the different risk assets need to be managed in this transition. And so big picture, this is effectively end of free money via the Bank of Japan. It's the end of easy liquidity. So you need to manage that transition carefully, but pushing away bit by bit is the signal to all the central banks and the hedgies that this source of capital is no longer there. This is trying to remove liquidity without causing instability in this managed transition. So the key question is can the system survive without endless liquidity from the Bank of Japan? And we all know what happens if they get the operation wrong. Well, they got the derivatives market where they hedge both sides. So they asset strip for as long as they can. They do it all funded by the national debt. But if it leads to a systemic risk event, they're too big to fail. So they socialize the losses, privatize the gains, and the Fed takes on the final debt. And so that's what's happening on the Japan side. So far, no big, and this is what I think the FIC is trying to do. Manage transition rather than catastrophe, but ready for catastrophe, because then you can socialize the losses, do the big print, and get the QE to take on the debt. So that was Monday. On Monday, we had the G7. On Tuesday, we had the Bank of Japan. What about Wednesday? Well, Wednesday was event 3. This is when we had the Federal Reserve meeting, with the first one ever, with the regime changed chairman of the Federal Reserve, which is Kevin Warsh. So it was his first ever meeting. Now, remember, FOMC is predominantly a bunch of banks, and the Fed is owned by the banks. So while everyone focuses on Kevin Warsh, which certainly he has influence, but he's only the chairman, his job is to read the script of what is decided by effectively, the governors and the board, which represent the bank's interest. And so I was suggesting that his first meeting would be rates unchanged. The narrative was built that he was a Trump puppet and he was going to reduce rates. And the MAGA people were like, Trump's taking on the Fed and the Fed's going to be powerless, and we'll launch stable coins, and we're taking on, the old British, financial system and the Rothschilds and various other things. That was what the Q drops were kind of signaling for the CIA PSYOP. But rates remained unchanged. And so no real surprise there, because leading up to this, we had the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And the closure of the Strait of Hormuz led to an inflationary cycle based upon the oil price shock. And we also had tariffs and various other things. So the real story is that, what did he focus on? Well, he focused on there will be less communications. So he wants market to decide rather than announcements to decide. He also talked about 5 task forces that will be set up. One of those is focused on data. And data is code word for saying, while we're focused on keeping inflation at 2% target, we probably need to change the way in which we measure inflation. And so expect a task force to continue along that. But he did reiterate that there will be a 2% target. Now, what does that do? Reiterating the 2% target when effectively he said the Fed has failed at their job, because I think it's like 36 months or, where we've been above 2%. It's a way of saying we're going to increase rates in terms of market expectations, which is the opposite of what the narrative of regime change by Trump, which was going to be forcing decreasing rates. So now he's made a commitment that he's going to be focused on that 2% target. And that really pushes the public debate to focus on rates again. So everyone will be debating. And whatever the Fed does means that you've got all of the markets by the kahunas. And so the narrative was meant to be that Trump's taking power away, merging Treasury, launching stable coins. But no, instead, Genius Act gave the banks the ability to use their Fed reserves to back a stable coin. Yield gave the banks the advantage. And they said, if you want to launch stable coins and pay yield, then crypto companies, you need to become banks. And so this is concentrating the power into the FIC and giving everything to the FIC. Because now the FIC can really, the real debate is not about what's happened. It is about power. The Fed's position. It controls, the credit creation. It controls liquidity. It controls the banking system. But the banks are the shareholders, so they're the real controllers there as well. It controls the bond market, whether you do QE or QT. It controls the stock market, whether you decrease rates and pump liquidity. It controls the housing markets. If you allow bond markets to rip on the 10-year, then that determines the rate of credit card debt, mortgage rates, private credit, all that stuff, government financing through the bond vigilantes, and basically the opposite of the MAGA narrative. The MAGA says Trump is taking on the Fed. The reality is Trump has given the Fed and the FIC maximum power. Think about it right now. There's only really 2 outcomes that are possible. There's two outcomes that are available to the Fed right now. Option one, they can basically create a crack up boom where they do what Trump says. They look like a Trump puppet because they significantly reduce the rates. It allows them to refinance the debt on the short term at these lower rates. And it pushes those bonds over to pensioners. And because that creates inflation, it means that whoever the bondholders are, they get a negative real yield. So you dump that onto the Fed, and this allows you to manage that transition. You dump that onto pensioners, but really you're letting inflation rip, redefining the definition of inflation and the data, while you're asking people to take on negative real yielding bonds. And so that's what happened if you lower rates and you do what a Trump puppet would do. But that would create massive asset inflation, which is why it's called a crack up boom. You basically inflate away the debt, massive asset price inflation. The stock market has a continuation of the bubble, the reality. You invest into data, you do fiscal dominance, you have a real estate rally, and then you need to increase the balance sheet to get those rates down on the longer term, because it was the longer term that was determining that, which forces QE. This leads to a credit expansion, more and more lending by the banks. This leads to a dollar debasement. You give up world reserve currency. Foreigners continue to sell off their bonds. And this is effectively where we were with the tariff policy. But you have a final speculative boom. You have the AI boom. You have the too big to fail because it's funded by private credit. You have national security because China will win the AI arms race if we don't do it. We got to put, data centers on space in order to, make sure that we have the energy saving. And that's really option one. So, but the Fed decides, because the Fed can decide whether they decrease the rates, and that's the cycle you choose. Option two is the alternative, which is a controlled rug pull. So you could decide to hold rates, or you could decide to push them higher. You'd have all the justification you need because you've got inflation. You've got this, this tight economy, but the stock market is booming like crazy. And you've got unemployment figures. And so if you decrease rates, you're kind of basically fighting against that. But if you increase rates, you're doing what the Fed would do under normal circumstances if it was considering unemployment and inflation. But you create a massive economic slowdown. And so really, this would be asset price correction. And asset price correction doesn't seem like an option here, but that would lead to capital reallocations into a multipolar world. And so basically, if the Fed wants a recession, this is what they did in the booming 1920s. The Fed created a recession after World War I that led to the Great Depression, and then the Great Depression created the environment that led to World War II, and then you had the transfer of wealth to the Fed, to the IMF, to the World Bank, and then that fueled the military-industrial complex. Then they came off the gold standard in 71, then you had the petrodollar, then you had FIC dominance, globalization, China manufacturing base, asset stripping through the bond market and pumping the stock market, where we are right now, fiscal dominance. But anyway, this would be a debt restructuring. But if the Fed wanted to do that, they could. And so they could choose the moment when they want to rug pull the American economy, which is why the Fed wins either way. And which is why the FIC has hedges. And it's why you can socialize the losses and privatize the gains. So, you cut rates and you're basically helping growth into a Trump rules the world narrative while the banks rule the world in the FIC there. Or you can hold rates and increase them, which you can say you're fighting inflation. And if you're fighting inflation, you can manage a transition into the multipolar world. And this is effectively why, they're doing this. Because once you do that, you then get a bit of an uprising of the extreme polarized left and the potential of a genuine uprising. If you had forks in the street, you had an uprising, you had a transition to a more communistic wealth redistribution. FIC doesn't want that. It would rather have multipolarity. So as the tensions get higher and higher and higher, you genuinely could have your thing disrupted by doing what Putin did. Putin basically took on the oligarchs and do what China did as well. China basically nationalized all the banks. Putin nationalized the energy. And that's a genuine threat to FIC if you were to switch to communism. If you were to switch to, and communism is not the right word, but more of a government-managed genuine uprising against FIC. And so if civil unrest is coming, you transition into multipolarity, and you've got the demographic issues, all the other consumption issues on debt, all this stuff, wealth inequality. So anyway, the Fed has the perfect narrative either way. The Fed controls timing. The Fed is controlled and owned by the banks. The banks are nodes in the FIC. And the FIC, remember, who's the largest shareholder in Switzerland's Bank for International Settlements? It is the Federal Reserve, because it's based upon the GDP. So if you adjust the GDP and you adjust it into multipolarity, then you give the other central banks more power in the Bank for International Settlements. And this is how you manage everything from Basel in terms of the FIC. And so, we're meant to be believing that this is what Trump is coming after. I think he's a World Economic Forum and FIC. He's doing everything he's meant to do, which is why he's still doing a great job for them. And so the Bank for International Settlements is the central bank of central banks. We talked about it a lot over time. And it's very interesting that the other events were done in Versailles, because the Bank for International Settlements was formed out of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. We'll go more a bit about over that. But this is really the global coordination layer, with the Federal Reserve being the one that has the highest voting right and the highest GDP. So this is where central banking power remains intact, no matter what happens into a multipolar world. And so the key question is, will the Fed take us into a crack-up boom under the new regime change chairman, Kevin Walsh, or will we do a controlled correction? I personally believe it will rinse the crack-up boom for as long as possible. And then the Fed has full control when to manage the full transition once you've got all the assets you can. And that's what I think the managed transition is. And so really that brings us into event 4 that happened. So just as a recap, on Monday we had G7. On Tuesday we had Bank of Japan. On Wednesday we had Federal Reserve. And on Thursday, lo and behold, the thing that everyone told me could never happen, happened, which is Iran-US signed the memorandum of understanding. And this really is the biggest event of the week, despite all the other things that happened. This is signed earlier than expected. It was meant to be signed on Friday. The Bank of England held rates on Thursday due to the kind of the negative, the potential of negative growth, the stagflationary environment. But by signing this at the, with the G7, with the other Europeans there, you really have the justification for holding rates at the Bank of England as well. Because it can be let's see what happens with energy costs. Let's see what happens there. But it was signed in Versailles. And the key terms of the MOU that was signed, going through it, there was 14 different points. But follow the money, those are the most important one. It effectively ends military operations. So as I've said, Iran has destroyed US bases. Those US bases, which gave the Iron Dome its power, which gave Israel its power, which gave strategic tension and the need for resistance, which allowed the money laundering operation between the bond market and stock market to happen. This ends military operations with the clause that I talked about with Lebanon in order to re-escalate if we need to, but never, it would always be bounded escalation. Just as I said with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, every time the rates went above 5% on the 30-year, 4.5% on the 10-year, and 120% on the 1-month forward oil, WTI or Brent crude, you needed a TACO narrative, market manipulation to renegotiate more contracts. It was bounded escalation. It never went to demand destruction, global depression territory. And so this is bounded escalation as well throughout the 60-day period. But it also gave sanction relief. Sanction relief is effectively code word for opening up the Iranian economy into a multipolar world order. It was also releasing frozen assets. So when the Shah purchased equipment from the MIC, and then we had the 1979 Iran revolution, then we had the sanctioning of those funds. Trump admits for the first time that this was Iran's money and we're just giving Iran money back. So we had, the release of frozen assets. We had sanction relief. These are all financial transactions. And that corrected oil prices and also pushed down the bond yields and started transitioning to the next phase, which is what was needed on the 30-year and the 10-year. It also had oil waivers. So basically, every day, Iran has 2 to 4 million barrels of oil that can come into the market. They're a member of OPEC, which coordinates amongst the Gulf countries. But with UAE coming out of OPEC, you now have the BRICS agreement, which is multipolarity version of OPEC, with UAE having FX swap lines instead of just Japan. So now you've replaced the carry trade over to UAE from Japan. And anyone else that gets an FX swap line to stop them selling their equities that would crash the market, or stop them selling their bonds that would blow out the yields on these bonds. And so you get these oil waivers. What else? Well, Iran has the second largest supply of LNG that will power AI and robotics, as well as a civilian nuclear program that is currently probably the largest Bitcoin miner in the world, that can also become a source of artificial intelligence, robotics, energy, EVs, leaning into that trade with China. And so is that going to be priced in yuan, in Bitcoin, or dollars? That's what's being really negotiated. And so we saw all of those narratives happen within Iran. So that really sets the framework. So how these deals are structured over the next 60 days is why you needed this managed transition, and why you needed for Iran to remain intact while you pretended you were regime changing, but you took out the ones that wouldn't be on board with this plan and moving forward, that are incentivized with MIC through the forever war, which is continuation of resistance, that creates the strategic tension, that justifies the budget to Israel, that justifies the money printing and America paying the bill for all of these wars, that redistributes wealth in a K-shaped economy up to stockholders in the MIC. If Iran and US sign a deal, then that breaks that trade, which is why I think this had to happen. So it also talked about Hormuz reopening, America ending the blockade during the 60 days, and we've already started to see Qatar shipments head over to India. So this is already happening. The whatever will happen, the negotiation phase with Hormuz, which they're saying will be controlled by Oman and Iran, in partnership with negotiations with strategic Gulf countries. Strategic Gulf countries that are also partnered with FIC. So that's where you get this FIC-aligned reorganization. And also there will be reconstruction plan. That reconstruction plan, as I said, wouldn't be reparations. It would be investment contracts. And those investment contracts, I think, will predominantly come from the Gulf, which is the process of normalizing that China did between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that's what plugs everything together. And so we now enter into a 60-day negotiation period. And already on cue, Iran is escalating with Lebanon. We got the Lebanon narrative. We got America exerting its influence. And we'll see what happens in that escalation cycle. We had a narrative that I believe said, look, Trump came out and basically said, why don't we just get Syria to manage this better? They'll do a better job with Hezbollah than Israel. Wow. That's pretty thing. What have I been saying? Everyone else was saying, because Giuliani was ex-ISIS, and ISIS was an Israel Western tool, that Giuliani was aligned with Israel. I said, no, he's aligned with Turkey and the Gulf countries. And so his job is to be a placeholder for Turkish and Gulf power. Israel will try and grab more land in order to try and get back to the Greater Israel Project and MIC. But if they lose, give the leverage to FIC. And now we get this narrative that Trump's saying, Syria, why don't you do it? I personally don't think that will happen, because that will lead to regional instability. And that's kind of a forever war model, make ISIS or ex-ISIS members that are now aligned with the Syrian government fight against Hezbollah. That would be sectarian tensions, do your whole Shia Sunni thing. And that's part of the forever war model. That's what, if Mick was still in charge, that's what would happen. But because Fick is in charge, I don't think that will happen. And so what might happen is Iran gets permission to target Israel without America, which we know what would be the end result of that. That would be destruction that leads to rebuild contracts that only the Gulf countries can afford. So we will see. Those are all possibilities, but I expect some kind of escalation there, but bounded escalation, as I said. It's not going to kill the deal. It's not going to lead to World War III. It's not going to lead to nukes. It's not going to lead, I don't believe, to US intervention. But we'll keep watching that and see if how my thesis plays out. But we had Trump statements, around that, and I interpreted that as a green light for Iran to target Israel as it targets Lebanon. And that fulfills the goals. It also helps in the negotiation process with Hezbollah in Lebanon, knowing that Iran targeted Israel, and you can have that kind of peace negotiation that maintains regional stability there. So Trump's statement anyway confirmed that Iran's money belongs to Iran. That's a radical change in narrative. You never get those types of emissions. It was also talking about something that led to a bit of the strengthening of the dollar as well, because he said, well, if we start doing this, like, people won't trust the dollar, which is true, but too late. But we had a strengthening of the DXY, which is the Western aligned currencies. But the other multipolarity currencies, they were strengthening relative to the dollar, while the dollar was strengthening less to Western aligned currencies like the Japanese yen, the European, the euro, and the Australian dollar and the Canadian dollar. Anyway, all this to say is that Trump didn't want a global recession. So I always said, and he admitted this, he said, follow the money, follow the markets. We every time we said this, the markets did this, and the market was the indicator. And really, Trump is saying stuff because his job is to weaken the empire and reveal it for what it is, so that all these tools don't work anymore. And now you get transparency. But the prevention of a global recession, and there was also talks, and the reason and the justification for signing this deal that Trump gave was because strategic petroleum reserves were running out. And if you look at it, China controlled oil prices through its massive reserves, but it was Japan and America that were draining their reserves. What happened to the MAGA narrative that they're draining China and their reserves? No, it was America and Japan that got drained of their reserves. Taiwan had to lean into bailouts with China, and China controlled the pricing because of its reserves. Prior to this, I told you, China has a massive chunk of the market, which is why it was buoying. It was buying all of this oil, and it allowed these Venezuela operations and Syrian operations to happen as well, because they were splitting the world up. They negotiated this. It was an alternative to World War III, which is a good thing. What else was in the deal? Civilian enrichment allowed. So nuclear energy program. Trump said the justification is because other people can do it. So how can I stop Iran doing it? I mean, these are major, major shifts in narratives. This is, empire unmasked. This is not the stupid, we're trying to prevent they're about to blow us up with a nuke. We care about women's rights. This is not they are a radicalized regime and we're taking on the Islamists. All of that BS is going away. This isn't death to America, death to Israel. This is the raw, hard, follow the money reality. And everyone else will watch this and say, right, if Iran can do it, we need to start showing more autonomy as well. So anyway, as soon as Iran is relieved from sanctions, there are 147 million barrels ready. Who buys those? What currency? There's going to be relief on all of these sanctions. Before they had to sell them to China, and they created the Hong Kong, UAE sanction circumvention monetary routes via the gold markets and oil markets that we've been talking about. But anyway, I mean, that's roughly $13 billion to hit the markets. And countries are already calling Iran saying we need to buy them. And so, these are how you reset. This is just like tariff policy. Every contract is a renegotiation as a result of this. So anyway, I'll be watching in future episodes all of the oil exports that happened here, what happens in the Hormuz. Iran can still escalate in these bounded escalations, depending on what happens with Lebanon. I'll also be following the insurance premiums. I think insurance markets are going to make it more expensive in the Hormuz forever. And so that changes these alternative routes that are going to be built. There'll be continual premiums. I'll be looking at the different LNG shipments as well. We'll be looking at the release of the frozen assets, how that happens. We'll be looking at Chinese participation. We'll be looking at Indian participation as well. Why the deal is different this time is because we've already seen Qatar LNG, which is now shipped out to India. So this isn't the same escalate to de-escalate that we were covering before. This is real. We even had meetings between UAE and Iran. I've often said they're playing good cop, bad cop in this operation, and the 5D chess is happening with Gulf countries, BRICS, and Iran. We also saw the Qatari and Iran energy integration meetings. I said in regional stability, you need these different corridors to be built to make sure regional stability maintains. We also started to see announcements around different forms of electricity grid integrations. The key point here is that the Gulf states acted like peace was coming before that. And I followed the money, and I told you the deals that were happening in Texas with Saudi Aramco and Golden Pass, 70% owned by Qatar Energy and Exxon. But Iran's new strategy from here, as I said, what was the old model? The old model was you fund Hezbollah, you fund Hamas, PMF as well, you fund the Houthis, and the resistance axis genuinely allows for the resistance against the MIC, which is done via Israel and Jews, Muslims hating each other narrative. That gives negotiation leverage for removing sanctions. And this is, what people found hard to believe, that Iran was doing that. That's how geopolitics works here. You can still be ideologically aligned in terms of resistance, but the end here is that resistance comes to an end because the alternative is you fund MIC and create the justification for the forever war. So the new model under FIC, which we're transitioning to right now, is trade, it's energy, it's infrastructure rebuild, it's BRICS alignment, it's SCO alignment, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it's GCC capital, it's China, it's basically transitioning the world based upon trade, transit corridors, trade corridors. The key points is that it's no longer, one what you're doing is you're surrendering one form of leverage and trying to replace it with another form of leverage. And so you're changing the leverage from what it was before, from resistance for sanction relief into now, providing the justification for the military industrial complex to create war, to the financial industrial complex, and your leverage now becomes your geography, your strategic geography. Iran has very strategic geography around the Gulf, around Central Asia, around South Asia, different caucuses, different areas, different north-south corridors. That's the real leverage now. And so the big question is, who's going to be the partners for the rebuild? Who's going to provide that funding? Who's going to actually build it? I think it's going to be Gulf funding. I think it's going to be some Iran autonomy from the deals. And I think it's going to be rebuild in partnership with China. And then there's going to be defense contracts across the region aligned with BRICS, Russia, some thick leverage based upon the leverage that they have, but also regional defense contracts across Pakistan, Egypt, Iran, Saudi funded, and Turkey. And so is Iran effectively at the end of this going to become a partner or simply an energy supplier? And that will really determine, and that's what we need to watch over the next 60 days as well. So what was event 4? The event 4 was we on the signing of the MOU. But the next one was the Versailles. Why was this done in Versailles? Why was this done in Paris? And at the same time, we had a bit of Bitcoin stuff, which I want to cover as well around all of this to tie it all together into what you can do and what's happening. So why does Versailles matters? Well, Versailles really is it's incredibly symbolic. It represents change and shift in powers. It represents the monarchy. It represents shifting to revolutions. It represents the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. It represents the rise and fall of the French Empire. It represents the battles between France and Britain, the Battle of Waterloo, where Rothschild gained its power over the debt capital markets. It represents debt structuring. It represents one of the most important events in history that set the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, which is the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was an agreement in Versailles in 2019 after World War I. And it was really set the origins for World War II. Because what happened after the Treaty of Versailles? Well, one of the things that was there is that it set up the monetary system from previous Versailles operations as well. So at the Treaty of Versailles, you had the Bank for International Settlements that was formed. It was formed to manage the reparation payments of Germany to the rest of the Western aligned forces. And it had to be paid in gold. And it was done with money printing via the German central bank. And it was aligned with Reichsbank. During World War II, it also supported the Hitler regime in when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. The Bank for International Settlements transferred the name of the gold from Czechoslovakia over to Germany. So it determined the outcome of the war after there was a monetary reform. So let's go through some of the monetary history. Now that led to the inflationary cycle, the Weimar Republic, and the monetary reform that happened in Germany, which people know the Holocaust and the history there and the crimes that happened there, but they don't know the monetary history. And I've covered it many times. But there were two key things that happened in Versailles. So the monetary sovereignty battle between France that needed funding in the Napoleonic Wars and the revolutions in order to maintain an independent central bank rather than borrowing from the Rothschild banking dynasties was a key feature of the war. What did Napoleon do? So if you look back at the monetary flows, I've often said the Napoleonic Wars were bankers' wars against the Rothschild families and an independent central bank that was not a debt-based central bank under the Rothschild format. And what did Napoleon do? Because he didn't want to borrow money and didn't want to be subordinate to the Rothschild family that he knew would have led to the types of Rothschild actions that led to the bond market, where the Rothschilds ended up cornering the British Empire by pretending after the Battle of Waterloo that France was going to win, and everyone started selling off their British bonds. And then covertly, the Rothschild family was buying them at the cheap, and then announced that England had won. And then that created the massive pump and the complete subordination of the British government to the Rothschild bondholders. Napoleon didn't want to go down that route. So instead of taking on the debt in this bankruptcy, he started selling off assets. And what was one of the key assets? It was Louisiana, sold to the United States of America. And so rather than taking on a Rothschild loan, Napoleon sold Louisiana to America, which was one of the best investments the United States of America had made as well. But this was all about avoiding dependency upon banking power. And this was sovereign financing. How do you finance yourself? Wars being kept in check when one is doing it via a debt-based system and the money printer in the Bank of England, and the other is trying to remain independent through the Central Bank of France. Well, anyway, that was one of the big stories. The other big part of the Versailles story is the Bank for International Settlements. That's where this emerged. It emerged from the post-World War I, architecture that was set up after World War I. The Bank for International Settlements later became the central bank of central banks. But really, it was a relationship between the Reichsbank, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the Bank for International Settlement, and the Swiss bank that funded both sides of the war. There was a moment when the Bank of England transferred gold over to Germany while simultaneously being at war, with Germany through the British Empire. That shows the separation of central bank and government. And this is really, what did Germany do after the Treaty of Versailles? Well, the debt was really loaded up, and it became such a massive debt burden that it was asset stripping the economy. So the banksters were asset stripping the economy, kind of like what's happening with the US right now. The reparations were defined in hard money, but you could print the fiat currency, which led to the hyperinflationary cycle. And that then led to the economic collapse because of the currency collapse, where people, those famous barrels of currency in Germany that were being used to heat houses because they were more valuable as wood or fire than they were as currency. But the resistance against that was a movement called National Socialism, i.e. what later became combined with a monetary policy plus a fascist policy. But what was the initiation of the monetary policy of that? Separate it with the fascist side as well. Well, there was arrest of Louis, let me get the name right. Louis Nefande Rothschild. I was making sure I get the right Rothschild on the notes. He was arrested by Hitler, and then they launched the monetary reform. And the monetary reform was a labor-backed currency that abolished usury, that abolished the process of combining credit-based system where money is created as a debt. And so it was basically state-driven credit that was invested in the productive side of the economy. That's what built Germany's manufacturing base. That is the same manufacturing base that is being rebuilt right now by the financial industrial complex. So companies like Volkswagen came from there. It employed people. It gave them incentives to have children. It was labor backed, but all of the investment went into debt-free manufacturing base. And it was non-inflationary. And it got rid of all the debt. And it made Germany very sovereign. Now, what did the Bank for International Settlements do? It created an environment where if you can fuel war, and why Hitler was funded by Wall Street, then rather than that labor-backed currency going to productive lending, as it does in China right now, state-backed banking, you can make it go to war, and that's unproductive lending. Then you can use the speculative markets, the financial industrial complex, to launch a currency war. And that's exactly what lost the war. It was when productive spending was used to fuel unproductive spending, which needed gold, which then required invasion, which was mercantilism, and the Bank for International Settlements and Wall Street facilitated that process. And that's what ended up, with the defeat. Because when the economy transitioned to a war economy rather than a productive economy, you end up in the situation, this asset stripping state power and handing over to private power. So this battle between war, power, monetary reform, this is a cyclical thing that's happened time and time again. And I think you can draw some parallels with what's happening with Iran right now. Effectively, the Iranian Revolution rejected Western financial industrial complex integration because that's what the Shah was doing. And so that revolution was a rejection of FIC. But when you reject FIC and you don't have a Western central bank based upon usury and a debt-based Ponzi scheme, you become embedded in military conflict in order to fight off the central banksters. And when you get embedded in MIC architecture, you end up serving the MIC. And so this battle, you revolt against FIC, but that creates the war where you become the justification for printing money in the invading country, or the West in this case. And so this tension between FIC and MIC seems like a cyclical repetition of what we can learn from here. But now what happened after the Iranian Revolution, the funding of resistance, and I've covered the history in many previous episodes, became the justification for money printing in the bond market in order to fund Israel and create a narrative and strategic tension that led to the laundering of money through FIC into MIC. And so this seems to be the cycle. FIC, MIC is now subordinate to FIC, but there's a cyclical element where you use MIC to do destruction and rebuild. The forever war model, the regional stability model. And that is the model. So we're now moving towards FIC integration. And you have to use your military to resist against the military, your military industrial complex to resist against their military industrial complex in order to set the terms of the rebuild and FIC. And that's the key points. If you look at the MOU, it was covering what a FIC world looks like, but what is the difference here? Previously, we were going from the Dutch Empire to the British Empire to the American Empire, Western aligned factions of power that are changing under one FIC. Now FIC is negotiating with BRICS based upon genuine China autonomy and a model where various Gulf countries got to keep their assets, but they were kind of aligned with FIC because they didn't have the military. So if you look at the Gulf countries, they had to align with FIC because they don't have independent military, but they use their resources, and that made them part of being able to influence FIC. China and Iran, they have their military, and Russia. They have their own financial system, and they have their own different models here. So this is why we're moving to multipolarity. But in order to subordinate Iran as much as possible, you need to destroy as much infrastructure for rebuild. And that's what we witnessed. You then need to make sure that people, the vested interests that wouldn't be on board the plan, are no longer there, which is what we witnessed. And then you need to make sure that there is an element of continuity in leadership. And you have some covert operations that's managed by the country that doesn't have the press department, which is China. And so military leverage in Iran is now becoming financial leverage. And that's why I'm watching this, because if it is Gulf, my guess is that it's going to be predominantly funded by Gulf countries. And that was the trade. The trade by Iran that they had to use is either get regime changed into forever war, or internal change in order to align with multipolarity and regional stability, given that the Gulf countries have their financial leverage and China has their resource and manufacturing-based leverage. And then they aligned into these blocks and they were able to decolonize from the Western forces. And that's what we've been witnessing. And this is why it was a slow transition. And I think FIC adjusted to that reality. And now the MIC is for rent by FIC, and FIC is transnational. And the TIC wants to build a global AI and surveillance state. And that's China and America, but the private corporate TIC interests. So this is why GCC, FIC, and China won the war. And that's who won. And I think that will be reflected in the end term sheet that we'll be watching. There is trillions in sovereign wealth that needs a home to invest. Iran has significant assets and significant geostrategic positioning, and the need for resistance is no more. And if you sign a deal between US and Iran that breaks the Israel narrative, then MIC is shedding itself of its assets and shedding itself of its partnership that led to the forever war, the death and destruction. So the region needs investment on every point as a result of this. And that's the opportunity. The opportunity is the rebuild of the infrastructure, the rerouting of energy routes, the currency that they're traded, the ability to have sovereign wealth funds, the new ports and who controls those ports, the logistics, the infrastructure, the insurance, the currency, the FX swap line, the OPEC, the BRICS, the GCC, the ASEAN, the SCO, the FIC, the MIC, the TIC, and the partnerships. The telecom infrastructure, who's going to control the data centers, the nuclear energy, the new forms of energy, the hydro energy, the solar energy, the LNG, the liquefied natural gas, the police and surveillance state, everything. These are all reconstruction, repositioning. And the key point to this, ownership is more profitable than war, the destruction phase. And that's how we were able to predict what seemed unpredictable. So I think the FIC is taking the lead from the Western side. This week, we basically connected. On Monday, we had the G7 event. New narratives, but also old narratives with Russia and Ukraine. New narratives with Lebanon, Israel, US, and Iran. We had the continuation of the breaking of the Japan carry trade on Tuesday with the Bank of Japan. We had the regime change at the Fed and the first meeting by Kevin Walsh. The ability to have dual narratives. So the Fed has complete control over where we go next through rate increases, QE, rate decreases, and open market policies. On Thursday, we had the signing of Iran, the Bank of England not doing much, reflective of the old guard of power, one of the lesser important nodes relative to the Fed in terms of previous empires at the Bank for International Settlements. And then we had whatever we're going to call this, Islamabad Accords at the new Treaty of Versailles. Signed at Versailles, Islamabad Accords, whatever we're going to end up calling this. The symbolism is incredible. Islamabad Accords is the recipient of the Belt and Road Initiative after expelling IMF interest, while the Gulf countries refinanced that IMF debt when Pakistan ran out of its dollars during COVID. Originally funded by UAE, refunded by Qatar and Saudi. China sets those corridors. Then it is signed from West in its retreat. Versailles, the old guard, the old monetary reforms, the old revolutionary monarchs, changes of power, the environment that set up the Great Depression and World War II that led to the creation of IMF and World Bank, transnational global entities that have now used this energy crisis to concentrate wealth up to transnational capital, that are now building this police and surveillance state based upon the global control grids, a one technocratic rule based upon where the data centers are formed. And this is the new structure. The new structure is that FIC is negotiating the opportunity into the Middle East with the Gulf countries, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the new members, UAE, Iran, Saudi Arabia as an observer, Ethiopia, Indonesia. I hope I'm not missing anyone. And Egypt, of course. So the FIC is negotiating into that corridor via the Middle East, which sets the terms of the petrodollar and petro-yuan, as well as the network of central bank digital currencies that was handed over from Enbridge over to China, UAE, Hong Kong. In the case of Europe, that's mixed territory. That's mixed opportunity. Manufacture civil unrest, build a police and surveillance state, do the same in America, continue the Putin is Hitler narrative, fight to the last Ukrainian. Russia ends up with its land. BlackRock ends up with the portfolio companies, ends up with the rest. And then global AI is China and TIC. So China and the executives that met in Beijing are building out the one global technocratic control grid. So Mick gets NATO spending. That was all solidified this week. Ukraine gets more corrupt spending that goes back into Mick stocks. You get more weapon sales. You get more intelligence integration. You get more defense budgets. You get a mixed stimulus. FIT gets reconstruction contracts, rebuild contracts, infrastructure contracts, capital deployment, more yield, acquisitions, mergers and acquisition activity, trade contracts, more insurance contracts. And TIC gets AI and robotics. It gets data centers in space. It gets every form of energy. It gets nuclear program, hydro. It gets renewable energy contracts. It gets stable coins. It gets social credit scores. It gets central bank digital currencies. And when there is too much asset stripping, because all the assets are concentrated in these pricing events, it gets universal basic income, which we covered in detail last week, and the impact that has, which is why asset ownership is the way you protect yourself. And so I want to go through one more thing, and I just want to reiterate that throughout all these different events, each week, there was still the operation to make sure that you don't own Bitcoin, just like the operation to make sure that you don't own gold and you hold it in custody as a paper contract instead. The Bitcoin FIC op that I've been covering over the years and the resistance against it, self-custody, should be becoming more and more apparent as we have these experiential learning lessons in real time. It is the same story. It is power and ownership. And the way they get power and ownership over you is through leverage. You remain in custody. You remain sovereign. You give up custody, you become subordinate to someone's leverage, whether it's debt, whether it's equity, whether it's derivatives, whether it's leverage, whether it's blackmail operations, whether it's degeneracy, whether it's through having, a weak person, bad health, bad family values, whatever it may be. That's how the leverage. Your resistance is ownership. Ownership without custody. That's control. And so what did we see with one of the Bitcoin Treasury companies that I've been warning you against all along? Well, an article was released around Justin. Sorry, I'm butchering your name. Justin. I'll make sure I try and put the article below anyway. He released an article around Nakamoto, the Bitcoin Treasury company, the vassalized into subordination David Bailey, one of the largest Bitcoin conferences, a Bitcoin venture capital fund, and a Bitcoin magazine media company. And by transferring dollars into Bitcoin in a Bitcoin Treasury company, and then purchasing the Bitcoin at the top, and then manufacturing a crash like the 1010 operation happened last year on Binance, then you end up with them having to borrow against their Bitcoin. That means that you need to transfer your Bitcoin into the custodian that's issuing the loan. And the custodian in the case of Nakamoto that was issuing the loan was a company that I invested in as a seed investor way back in the day, a company called Kraken. And so Kraken now controls the Bitcoin in order to issue the loan and provide the collateral. And according to the article, 85% of all the Bitcoin is now pledged as collateral against that loan. You add massive expenses, which means that you may need to sell the Bitcoin in order to cover it. And if you can engineer price corrections, you can get a margin call on that loan, where Kraken calls Nakamoto and says, put the rest of your Bitcoin in or we're selling it. And if you don't put the rest of the Bitcoin in, they sell it. And if you can't cover the interest, you need to sell more Bitcoin in order to cover the interest. And that's why they create these vehicles like Strategy to arbitrage and control the short-term price so that they can put you in liquidation crisis, liquidation risk, as a result of you taking on counterparty risk. The lesson here is debt changes everything, which is why I talk about subordination vehicles, the subordination industrial complex. They want you subordinate, and you resist by being sovereign. And this is what financialization and the financialization cycle has done. It is to remove ownership from you and give you a paper version so that you can be leveraged through securitization so that you own a paper version or a security so that they can then use the derivative market in order to rehypothecate and engineer a too big to fail system, socialize the losses, privatize the gains, or draw you into Chapter 11 where they can lock in the price of Bitcoin, take the Bitcoin, auction it off to the FIC, and recycle through these M&A transactions and distress sales. So they want to create systematic risk. This is the design of the system. This is what the Fed was created for. This is why after it was created in 1913, we had World War I, then we had a pump cycle, then we had a Great Depression, wealth transfer. This is why we had long-term capital management. This is why we had the global financial crisis, where BlackRock's technology was used in order to acquire the assets, take out Bear Stearns, take out Lehman Brothers, strip the ETF department from Barclays, and give it to JP Morgan and BlackRock. This is why we had COVID. This is why we had the tariff war. This is all concentration of wealth in a K-shaped economy to make more and more businesses subordinate to the financial industrial complex. And the only way I know to fight back is through self-custody in an asset where you can own it, you can spend it, and they can't debase it, but they can create paper versions of it to try and psyop you into giving it to them. And so when you have self-custody, You have no lender to be subordinated to. You have no counterparty to be subordinated to. You have no margin call to be subordinated to. You have no liquidation terms to be subordinated to. Unlike strategy. Now, strategy, as I've said, levered up on a Bitcoin, share price, MNAV premium, where it could sell shares in order to buy Bitcoin, and then that dilutes the shareholders, but they end up with more Bitcoin. In a price rise, that's great. When the price is going down, you end up diluting shareholders, and you end up with a premium that is shrinking. Once the premium shrinks, where the value of the shares or the market cap of the company is close to the value of the Bitcoin, you no longer have any shareholder value. So you need to create a new product. What was that new product? It was convertible debt. Now, convertible debt means that the FIC lends money to you. They get a higher yield. And if the price is going up, it converts into equity. That's all good. But if the price is going down, then it never converts to equity, and you need to repay that loan. From my understanding, there's about $10 billion of convertible debt, plus the yield that needs to be paid on that debt. So this works if the conversion happens, but if the price doesn't go up and the conversion doesn't happen, then you can engineer the short-term price. You have a two-way bet there from the fixed perspective, but it doesn't work if the conversion doesn't happen. So now what do you do if the conversion doesn't happen? Well, if the conversion, if the price is falling and therefore it never triggers into equity, and you've got approximately $10 billion of exposure, then debt must be repaid. Where do you get the money to pay that debt? You either issue more options, create more arbitrage, or you issue more equity. But if the premium's not there, then what do you do? As long as the premium's there, you can keep doing that. And you increase the dividend on STRC, what you're calling digital credit, which is really just another convertible debt instrument that stays at $100, that takes away the upside of Bitcoin, but you try and guarantee with the value in your equity that you'll keep the price at $100. You can either incentivize, as it decouples, people to buy it, arbitrage it, or pay more dividend, or just stop paying the dividend. And so this is not a Ponzi scheme. It is a subordination vehicle to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible and make sure that you own a security that Jane Street and the financial industrial complex can use to control the short-term price of Bitcoin. And nothing more, nothing less. So you either issue more equity, you issue more debt, or you sell the Bitcoin. And so that's why shorter term, this is a great opportunity for those that are dollar cost averaging to build a Bitcoin position over the next years that they could never have built before. Because they built this game, they're deploying this game, they won't be able to control the long-term price because self-custody Bitcoin, you own, you spend, and there'll only ever be 21 million. And more of them disappear over the time as people lose them. But they want to centralize as many of them as possible. And that's what these vehicles are for. Bitcoin treasury companies are subordination vehicles for FIC. It's structural. It's architecture. Whether it happens on purpose by the people being fooled into creating one, or it's done more maliciously. I don't care. I don't matter. It's just structure. It's incentives. It's game theory. It's architecture. It's got, forget the personalities. Forget the celebrity worship. It is what it is. So equity issuance dilutes the Bitcoin per share. And this whole thing can create some more, Bitcoin selling pressure, and it can either destroy the vehicle into Chapter 11, which I don't think is the goal, or keep the vehicle alive to try and centralize as much of it as possible. And the refinancing needs ever increase. It creates a dependency upon FIC for that refinancing. Or when the FIC doesn't want to do it, you create a retail product. And that's why we're getting maximum amounts of arbitrage volume here. The premium risk can disappear, and then you need a new tool. So the model requires the premium. The model requires the price of Bitcoin to go up to keep that model alive. But in the meantime, as it goes down, you can try and centralize as much of that Bitcoin as possible. And that premium can fund Bitcoin purchases, and that's the structure if it works. If the premium depreciates and it goes into a discount, we saw all that before. Now you're Barry Silbert. Now you're GBTC, Global Bitcoin Trust Company. This isn't new. This is done before. And that was plugged into Gemini and FTX and Celsius, and then they engineered Operation Choke Point 2.0. I did a video, I did an interview on the What Bitcoin Did podcast recently. It may have been released today, but next week I think we're going to play it. And I went through this in detail. But we've already seen this before with Operation Choke Point 2.0. Now it can lead to a Chapter 11 cycle, or it can, and then that concentrates wealth upwards as well. I'm not saying strategy is going to go into Chapter 11, but they can take all the other vehicles into Chapter 11 and centralize it further. That was the end result. And that was when Barry Silbert and GBTC ended up creating the Bitcoin ETF. That Bitcoin ETF was then done by BlackRock and all the other FIC providers in order to push that premium and discount into the ETF vehicle. So it's a centralizing force. The value proposition seems to change, but the key points here, Bitcoin is not the risk, because it's no longer the risk of Bitcoin. It's the financialization that's the risk, provided you're not becoming a trader. So how do you win? You own more Bitcoin this month than last month. You hold it in self-custody. And if you want to support the network, you run nodes and you become more sovereign, not less sovereign. So the final thesis of putting this all together is that this week, I think, while it seems like unrelated events, I think this week must be remembered as the week where really the world repositions itself. The Versailles meeting, I think, will go down in history. The MOU will go down in history. The Bank of Japan going in independent and breaking the Japan carry trade, it will go down in history. The G7 meeting, where the narrative between the divorce between Israel and US started and set up the next game that would lead to the breaking of the petrodollar, the GCC side. All of that was set up long term, but many of it came together this week. And anyone that's watching Simon Dixon Hard Talk live would be prepared for that and was able to position himself accordingly. The key is getting ahead. Look, I've noticed something, that I say very unpopular things, and then 2 years later, they kind of become popular and it's safe to say it. But I try and say it when it's unsafe to say it. And right now, I already led into that you will be told Israel rules the world, and it's unpopular to say the otherwise. 2 years ago, I was telling you about all the Israeli ops, 9/11, JFK, all that type of stuff, the false flag of October the 7th, when it was really, really unpopular. Now it's very popular to talk about it. Same with the Celsius side. I remember going through that. Same with Bitcoin. Same with banking reform. Like, when you follow the money, it gets you 2 years ahead. You say the things that gets you hated, and then in 2 years, it becomes a popular narrative. And then you got to say the things that get you hated again. That's what I try and do on Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. So anyway, the world has been repositioned. The Middle East is moving towards integration and regional stability and partnerships with FIC. FIC becomes the danger, whereas MIC was the danger. Europe moves towards, basically a subordinate to MIC and continual tension. The Fed remains the ultimate power of the financial industrial complex in cooperation with the asset managers and BlackRock and the investment banks like JP Morgan. But ultimately, the Fed can decide when this transition happens or how far they can asset strip into this K-shaped economy. The FIC is strengthened overall because Trump was a FIC agent. Biden was mainly a MIC agent. Trump was a FIC agent, and JD Vance will be a TIC agent. MIC basically secures future revenues. And we had the real understanding, if those who were watching, between the Bitcoin financialization. One of those things, I was talking about Michael Saylor when it was really unpopular. And again, not the character, just what was being created here. Did the same with Jack Mallers and Nakamoto and David Bailey. And then it becomes okay to say it. We're now in the okay to say it stage where everyone starts. The same people that were pushing the Bitcoin Treasury companies are now, traffic whoring of criticizing the Bitcoin Treasury companies and getting margin called. So Bitcoin financialization will accelerate. It's inevitable. It's predictable. And my final message to you, as always, is follow the money. The money will tell you basically where the power is moving, what's happening. We'll keep covering it. When conflict is ending, when others think it's still continuing because of history, where capital is flowing, and really we can try and have a hypothesis for what happens next. And that's what I try and do every single week. So I'm going to ask you a favor. I don't take any sponsorship. I'm as sovereign as I could be. Everything I share is things that I do. I don't monetize. I've got monetization off on all of my channels. I sold my business, so I'm not trying to upsell you into anything. I have no partnerships or affiliate schemes where I'm trying to push you in a certain direction based upon financial interest. So all I like is that if you enjoy this, I do this for myself so that I have every week have to have the discipline of putting this together and following the different tasks. It gives me a goal. But what I'd really appreciate is if you could subscribe to me on YouTube if you're not a subscriber already. We've got 172,000 subscribers. I think that maybe 60-70% of you that are watching are not subscribed. If you appreciate it, then I'd like to get that up to at least 210,000 subscribers in commemoration of Bitcoin's 21 million supply. Let's see if we can get there. So please do subscribe, hit the bell symbol, hit all. And I promise you, I will keep adverts off. I won't have any sponsorship, and I'll just give you the best of what I've got. And I need you to subscribe as well. Now, if YouTube takes me down, I need you to head over to Rumble and put in Simon Dixon, go to my channel and follow me over there, because we're going to be going there if they take me down. I also want you to follow me on X if you're not, where I give real-time updates at Simon Dixon Twit. Just in case YouTube takes us out, we'll continue to stream there as well. Now, also, I'd like you to head over to Apple if you're an iPhone user and subscribe to my podcast so that you can download this and watch this on the move in case any of those social networks take me out when we're building our social credit score. You could do the same in Spotify if you use Android or another one as well. Look up and hit there, and then it will notify you, and then it will download right to your phone. So you can do this while you're at the gym, do this while you're driving, whatever it may be. And also at simondixon.com, in case I get taken out of all those networks, and once the social credit score and AI grids become two things, I've been feeding all of my content to produce blogs, to produce 5-minute whiteboard videos, to create 30-minute, 20-minute summaries so that you can save having to watch this whole thing. All of those are hosted on simondixon.com. If you would like to receive a newsletter every week where I don't sell anything, don't promote anything, but I just give you a weekly newsletter, because if I get taken out, my only choice is to email you, because I built my own infrastructure to try and be as sovereign as possible on simondixon.com. So as a reward for you joining my newsletter, and you can create a username and password, and we've got a membership portal, which is the community I've built, that I think we may need to use one day. as our social credit scores and AI and CBDCs and everything gets more aggressive. So get yourself a username and password over at simondixon.com. Go to the homepage and press, I think there's a yellow button at the front. And there's a bunch of videos there. You can even get the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin for free as a PDF. A video series I created in 2020 called The Great Depression of the 2020s. And a bunch of backups for everything. And you can communicate with all the other people there as well. We'll figure out how to make that more useful as a community as we progress. But that's what I'm doing. And so make sure you got a username and login. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history, as well as one of the most petrifying times if you don't have access to this information. So please share, please like, please share it with other people that you think should get access to this information, even if this is a condensed version on my blog or this video, just a retweet. Please leave some comments. I do read those to create more content. Things you agree with, things you disagree with. Really helps the algorithm to get this out to more people. And I will continue to go on other people's podcasts. Can you post on X and let me know and tag other people where you'd like me to be on their podcast? Let's do this together as a community effort. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. I want as many people in my community that are on the right side of this change. So I have a 10-year plan, whether this happens faster or not. Hopefully we can make this transition together with in peace. So now at part 2, I'm going to play over and premiere on my YouTube channel right after this, and it will redirect it if you're watching this live on YouTube over to an interview that I did on BTC Sessions, where I discussed who actually won the war and how it's not USA. Nathan teases out many of the content that I haven't covered before. So that will be premiering over on my YouTube channel. And I look forward to seeing you this time next week on Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. Peace.
In our last conversation, you were basically setting up that the end of the Iran war would come right in line with the IPOs.
I think it's already been signed, and now they're just playing theatrics. They're trying to time it with the liquidity needs of the major IPOs that are coming.
Where do you think we're heading next? What's your read on the situation?
Who won? The financial industrial complex and transnational capital won. The reality is China won. That means that they can control both the petrodollar and petro-yuan. If you think Trump works for the American people, then nothing makes sense. Trump's a transaction guy. His job as a deal maker is to put deals together for his lobbies. The markets were never saying that this was a real war. If there was a real war, I was saying gold would be moving in parallel to oil. They have completely cornered the short-term price of Bitcoin to manipulate it, but their goal is to get your Bitcoin in custody. The technical industrial complex are ushering in an Orwellian AI surveillance state, one world control grid, social credit scores, central bank digital currencies, stable coins. You will own nothing and be happy. We'll custody the assets, you get the token, and you become a perpetual gambler.
All right, good morning, Simon. Thank you so much for joining me, for jumping back on. I needed to have you back because in our last conversation with Professor Dave Cullum, you were basically setting up that the end of the Iran war would come right in line with the IPO, so the SpaceX IPO. And lo and behold, you were bang on. You were dead right. We got the first whispers of it the Thursday before, I believe, coming from the Pakistan Prime Minister. We had the SpaceX IPO on Friday, and then on Sunday, with the whole 250th anniversary celebration there in the UFC event, they were saying it was done. It was completed, and it seems to be that actually was the case. So I wanted to get your immediate kind of response, your feedback. Looks like the deal is done. I'm curious, where do you think we're heading next? What's your read on the situation?
Yeah, sure. So if we rewind back when I first came on your podcast to discuss Iran, I think it was like 100 days ago or something to that, when it first broke out. Prior to that, we were discussing Venezuela and various other things. When the Iran war broke out, the headline on your video was me saying, this is a war, a managed transition between the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex represents the more nationalistic, US-dominated post-World War II Bretton Woods order. And the financial-industrial complex are transitioning the world into multipolarity, while the technical industrial complex are ushering in an Orwellian AI surveillance state, one world control grid that consists of artificial intelligence, social credit scores, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, tokenize everything. You will own nothing and be happy. We'll custody the assets, you get the token, and you become a perpetual gambler. That's those were like the dynamics at work. And so if you look through what we saw, Netanyahu, I've always said, is middle management for the military industrial complex. That consists of, the radical Zionists in Israel, the neocon evangelical Christian boomers in America, and then factions of power within the IRGC that benefit from the continuation of a forever war. Those are, kind of the net beneficiaries of servicing the military industrial complex. If you want to transition to a world of multipolarity, the Middle East becomes effectively a go-between, a financial go-between between China-led BRICS SEO blocks and America as a regional power that dominates Europe and the Western Hemisphere. But private corporate interests dominated by those three factions of private corporate power, MIC, FIC, and TIC. And so FIC aligned with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, which are predominantly funded by energy purchases from China. So transnational capital, you have, the financial industrial complex, which is hosted in New York, the stock market, the bond market, London factions like the insurance market, the FX markets, the derivative markets, the Swiss Bank for International Settlements. But all the liquidity is on New York, in the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. And so that faction co-opted the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, i.e. you get to joint invest in every deal. But because they are trade surplus countries and America is world reserve currency, the dollar becomes a vehicle for asset stripping the West. And then you have to partner with those that maintain their energy and are able to have large sovereign wealth funds who end up purchasing all the assets. And as they purchase more and more assets, they exert more control. Foreign direct investment is the vehicle for exerting control in the financial industrial complex, assets under administration. But it is all backed up by the largest manufacturing base in the world, which is China. And so that creates an informal allegiance of capital, which can dictate the flow of funds globally. And the other part of that is energy. And so the energy part, you got Netanyahu, that is the most paid figurehead for the military industrial complex. For the financial industrial complex, you got Trump. Trump's a transaction guy, and his job as a deal maker is to put deals together for his lobbies. And his lobbies he's mainly aligned with FIC. He's not a neocon. He's a bankster that kind of looks, he's a deal maker that works for capital. Yeah. Is the way to think about him. Then you have, so by closing the Strait of Hormuz, you manufacture a crisis, just like COVID shutdowns, which was also under the Trump administration, Operation Warp Speed 2.0. But you manufacture a pricing event that concentrates wealth upwards, which is more like the Global World Economic Forum agenda. And when you think about all those different companies, let's say the CEO, the representative of the World Economic Forum is Larry Fink and BlackRock, because they got the most assets under administration. And Larry Fink and BlackRock, is kind of part of this financial industrial complex. And so by pricing everyone out, you get massive concentration of power upwards. you get through fiscal dominance a stock market boom, and the tension happens in the currency market and the bond market. And so throughout this whole war, I was saying once the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, I was looking at the yields on the 30-year, the yields on the 10-year, the price of oil as a mechanism for pricing everyone out and creating inflation. And the markets were never saying that this was a real war. If there was a real war, I was saying gold would be moving in parallel to oil, as well as looking at those bonds. And then eventually that would justify an environment for QE in order to prop up stocks. And so the market knew that this was a temporary state of being. And so I was always expecting a deal to be done. Now, I didn't get the timing right. I was saying that this is going to be similar to the 12-day war. But once I saw that the Hormuz was, the strait was going to be closed, I could see that there was the opportunity to renegotiate every single contract, including the flow of energy, and that this was going to manage a transition of about 2 to 5 years of events into probably a concentrated, what looks like, a 90-day period followed by a 60-day and everything that goes in between. But the markets were telling me that this was theatrical, but also a power struggle. And so I go back to who won. The financial industrial complex and transnational capital won. And so we're now getting into the phase of managing narratives so that we can transition to this multipolar world order. And so the first stage was to announce the deals being done. And the last time we talked, I said, liquidity is incredibly important right now. And so in the leading up to the Xi Jinping and Trump meeting, I thought something will change there. I thought maybe that would be the timing to get a deal done. But what it actually was, it was a signal. It was a signal for Xi Jinping to exert his, let's say, optical vision of how the world has changed. That it is all the Mick and Fick and Tick executives begging Xi Jinping to not shut down their factories of cheap labor, to not shut down their rare earth minerals for all of this AI bubble that's needed, and to make sure that semiconductor chips are still flowing. And that was the purpose of the Xi Jinping meeting. And Xi Jinping publicly said, leave Taiwan and we're all good. And that was really it. And so Trump came and said, Taiwan off limits to the MIC. And the MIC, now we entered into a transitionary phase. And that transitionary phase was publicly stating, here's what a deal looks like. And that is a FIC deal. If you look at every single part of the 14 points, these are financial transactions. And the construct of those financial transactions is what the purpose of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the theatrical war in order to lead to this resetting of the world order. So now we've got the 14 points. And I said, what would I do if I were FIC? Well, I'd probably want to make sure that the SpaceX IPO went very well. And so one way of ensuring that it goes very well is to announce on the Thursday prior to the Friday, have the weekend, and then come back on a Monday. And it required vast amounts of liquidity, because if the SpaceX IPO doesn't go well, then that will affect the stock market, Anthropic, OpenAI, and it will weaken the negotiations for the FIC. And so this was the point at which the FIC, which ultimately controls the MIC, exerts their right. This is a managed transition. There's bounded escalation. Oil's allowed to go up to these prices, but every time it goes to demand destruction phase, then Trump, you need to do some kind of taco story. And so Trump will come out with a taco. There'll be a bunch of market manipulation, but it will get the price of oil down, from that bounded level. And every time the yields were blowing out above 5% on the 30-year, 4.5% on the 10-year, you get another taco. And so bondholders, which are FIC, and their portfolio of LNG and oil companies that were benefiting from these higher prices. And the reason this was so chaotic is because Trump's middle management, he probably doesn't know what's coming next. His job is to just create a narrative, and FIC is trying to get the best terms, and Trump is the front man, just like in China, right? I'm the front man for all these real power, all these executives. Those executives work for the board. The board are representative of the shareholders, and the shareholders is dominated by FIC. And so that's the hierarchy. Trump's the gateway to FIC. Netanyahu's the gateway to MIC. In MIC, you have the deep state, Mossad, MI6, and CIA. And so you bound these escalation cycles, but ultimately, when a deal needs to be done and when FIC's ready to do it, you can say, hey, Mick, why don't you go blow up Lebanon? Why don't you escalate there? And then that will give us more leverage. And then Trump and Netanyahu play good cop and bad cop. And so Trump says, we're doing a deal, we're doing a deal. Netanyahu says, no, you're not, I rule the world. That creates a public narrative for Americans, given that they've decided or they've been exposed to the new narrative that they didn't have before, that Israel rules the world and this the Epstein class and Netanyahu is the power of all powers. You know, that is the narrative, because eventually Trump will exert influence over Netanyahu. Netanyahu will be regime changed. And then we'd lead to an Israel that integrates into GCC and FIC and manages its transition away from being the forever war model. And so that's what I'm thinking is coming next. On the Iran side, you needed to put it into a position where it has to get reconstruction contracts and it doesn't have financial capacity in order to rebuild that without negotiating. And I said, you know, Iran will go deeper into China. Israel will go deeper into GCC. And then China normalizes between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And you have a bunch of good cop, bad cop. Iran's job is to destroy the US military bases, manufacture the crisis event, close the Strait of Hormuz. UAE is to kind of play good cop, bad cop with Saudi, where Saudi looks like the one that's, we're not going to normalize until there's Palestinian state. UAE looks like we're going deep into Israel. They come out of OPEC. That breaks the petrodollar, which is required. You also have the tariff war that pushes Japan away. So you need rates to go up to break the Japan carry trade. And then you change the euro dollar. The euro dollar is FX swap lines. And so lo and behold, UAE gets an FX swap line while coming out of OPEC, which is both halves of the petrodollar breaking. So you break the petrodollar, you break the euro dollar, and you break the Japan carry trade. And then you vassalize Europe up into the Western Hemisphere, into American private control. The region of the Middle East becomes effectively West Asia, which is, you know, integrated into a BRICS, GCC, SCO regional. You get a new regional security model, which is Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia being a financier. A new financial corridor, which is UAE, which ended up getting the network of central bank digital currencies, Enbridge, the FX swap line with the Federal Reserve, so it can now create dollars, and the breaking of OPEC, which was what propped up the petrodollar. All of that happens in UAE, and Iran, now the second largest LNG provider in the world, is going to have a bunch of LNG contracts to be renegotiated, a bunch of rebuild contracts, which are going to require significant investment. And what are they going to price those 2 to 4 million barrels of additional oil that will come on? And so there was always a belief that some people would believe that Trump was playing 5D chess. The one that was playing 5D chess is the one that doesn't have a press department, China. and China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Iran and the GCC had a very clever strategy for redefining the industry. And the story will be told when you look at who gets the investment contracts. I guarantee you, or my hypothesis is that there'll be a bunch of China Belt and Road Initiative, GCC Gulf Country Sovereign Wealth Funds, and financial industrial complex nodes that Trump was representing to get as much of a foothold, so that regional stability is now the dominant game that everyone's incentivized to play. From Iran to Saudi to UAE to Turkey to Egypt to China to BRICS to SCO, to the private corporate interest that owns the West. And that's the transition I think we're seeing. So what is being dominated right now? We needed to have, and I remember saying this early on, a three-way narrative that allows for Israel, America, and Iran to be able to push back to their relative constituents that kind of gets the most radicalized version of their fan and political base to believe they won. The reality is China won, and Iran is somewhat of a proxy of China. I don't think proxy is the right word because they maintain their own, autonomy. And I'm just trying to simplify because there's different factions of power within each country, which are more aligned and less aligned. But there's no doubt that there was no regime change. IRGC, if you remember what I said those that were negotiating before the war are all still alive, and they were negotiating during the war and after the war. That's Arachi, that's Galavant, that's all the people that are still putting forward this deal right now.
Did they get the hardliners out? I know we talked about getting rid of the hardliners in the IRGC in Iran. Did they actually remove the hardliners, or does it appear that they did?
Yeah, so that was Israel's role. Israel's role was, again, this goes into the bit more conspiratorial part of it. But I believe that there was a faction of power within Iran that they can never admit, so we'll never be able to prove this, because it would cause regional instability and all sorts of stuff. But there was a faction of power within Iran that was aligned with China, and Iran was reporting to China in order to transition to this regional stability model. Here's the people within the IRGC that would never be on board. And those were the ones that were decapitated. And that was Israel that they outsourced that to. So Israel did the decapitation campaigns. American military industrial complex profited from breaking up, killing infrastructure. Iran got all the US infrastructure out of the region. China would then go to Pakistan and say, you put together the regional model and you get the Islamabad Accords. Anything that's negotiated will have your name on it. Why Pakistan? Because Pakistan was the recipient of the Belt and Road Initiative. It was expelling the IMF. It used to be an IMF dollar vassal. It ran out of dollar reserves during COVID. Then it had to take bailout from the Gulf countries, which was UAE. Saudi then refinanced UAE, and China implemented Belt and Road Initiative. And it's important for the corridor of the post-world order as well, in terms of ports and various things, and the security agreement after US is expelled from the region slowly in terms of the MIC. And that's in effect how it played out. What we're at the phase of right now is a deal has been reached with, Iran stopped funding Hamas about a decade ago. It was predominantly funded by Qatar. Iran funded the military arm, but Qatar funded the political arm. And then the military arm got more aligned. And then there was a whole thing of Israel wanting continual state of conflict in order to justify the false flag of October the 7th. And so the Israeli banking system via UAE was allowing Qatari money via Qatar to fund the military arm of Hamas. Now, people interpret that as, so Hamas are traitors or something. It's way more nuanced than that. All you need to do is infiltrate at the higher levels, Iran to stop backing at higher levels, and most people don't know who they're working for. So it's way more nuanced than that, and that's how all these things work. It's on a need to know basis. There's genuine resistance, there's genuine grievance here, but we all know that October the 7th was nothing like it was reported in the media. That's because Netanyahu, the MIC, the deep state, they can feed stories into the Western media. Like, all of the fake stuff came from Netanyahu, was perpetuated by Biden. And none of the things that were allegedly happened on October the 7th were as they were reported. And the Hannibal Directive was initiated, where Israel put out Apache helicopters that killed loads of Israelis. We had the fake news that was reported on I won't say things that will get this YouTube, that YouTube won't like. But anyway, it was a BS operation, to make it look that was meant to happen because the destruction of Gaza was part of the plan. And if you remember correctly, it was leaked. The plan was leaked that the IMF was going to forgive Egypt of $18 billion if they ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and put them in the Sinai desert. But Egypt didn't do that because they had an alliance with GCC. And Saudi was saying, I will not normalize with Israel until there's a Palestinian state. And they've been saying that for 25 years. You won't hear that in Western media because they want you to think that Saudi's just a vassal of Israel and Zionism. But no, the order's changed because MIC isn't dominating the region anymore because of the rise of China, change of energy, and all the different things from changing the market. So all of this to say, when you follow the money, it's completely different to the narrative. And if you believe politicians are in charge, then you'll forever be in a state of confusion here. When you understand the West is controlled by private corporate interests, Mick, Fick, and Tick, then actually Trump did a great job for Mick, Fick, and Tick. The military got to profit from the war. The stock market got a stimulus of the 1.5 trillion Pentagon budget. The financial industrial complex is leaning into the investment contracts that will come, the rebuild contracts. They want a multipolar world so that they can invest into a multipolar world. They're partnered with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds in China. And the technical industrial complex want an AI-dominated world. We are definitely getting an AI-dominated world.
Yeah.
The contract, the entire world is flipped upside down now for this AI-dominated world. Now, what's interesting is that requires vast amounts of energy. So what is the public-facing narrative of this war? Nuclear weapons, terrorist financing. That's just public consumption BS. This was always about nuclear energy, the pricing of that energy, and the transition to a multipolar world. And in order to achieve that, you needed to close the Strait of Hormuz. In order to close the Strait of Hormuz, you need to say Iran needed to say we will target any ships. Lloyd's of London need to say we won't insure you, and then US needed to say we'll allow the shipment to get through on our part of the blockade. And the only ships that got through required Lloyd's of London, US, and IRGC to let them get through. The only people that had that leverage is China, and China had relationships via BRICS to India, and then there's GCC, Qatar, and various other things. And you also remember that I said there was a wave of hedged investment prior to the war. One is that China built up the largest oil reserves in the world that exist, so they could control the price of oil and survive it all out. So it was never about. They were also very aware of both the Syria operation, where there was a change in leadership, a regime change there. Also the Venezuelan operation. Those were allowed to happen by China, by Iran, and by Russia. And that's why those were smooth operations. There's no way those would be that smooth unless world leaders had agreed that this is the way that we would like that to go. And so, that was leading up to that. Qatar had invested in the Golden Pass, a partnership with ExxonMobil that benefits from all the LNG in Texas. Saudi Aramco had made an investment into a subsidiary, Mavura, which was 100% owned by Saudi Aramco, that is benefiting from refining oil from Venezuela in Texas. And we had the alternative pipelines that had been built that would reduce the amount of oil, but allowed UAE and Saudi Arabia to effectively, get alternative pipelines out there. The only way to stop them would be if the Houthis shut down the Red Sea. And the Houthis never shut down the Red Sea. Why? Because the Houthis had already signed an agreement over Yemen. And Yemen, remember, there was that little war, fake war, I called it, between UAE and Saudi and Yemen. That resolved Somalia, Yemen, the ports, and all of the different ports prior to any of this happening. And so if you were following this all the way through, right from Trump administration 1, you could see that Iran was managing a process of regional integration backed by China. And this was the final part of the process. The negotiations had started a long time ago, and I believe that the negotiations were the theatrical war that we just watched. Now, that doesn't mean that the deaths didn't happen, because the Mick is always willing to kill people. I mean, that's just part of the game. Israel and the radical Zionist factions of Mick, if they want to do some false flags, if they want to get some leverage, if they want to try and change a game, they can. Some of the people in power within IRGC partnered with Russia. They can try and flip the board. So throughout this, you had your factions of resistance against the FIC plan. But I always believed the FIC would ultimately win. And the FIC has, I believe right now, ultimately won. And that's the phase we're at right now. That's what's being negotiated.
Look, that's fantastic. Let me just pull apart a few things there. One, something that Doomberry actually said to me the other day really stood out, because you talked about how the GCC wanted the corridor, wanted the area open for business. The financial industrial complex wanted that area stabilized and open for business. And he was pointing out that if Iran is going to have an environmental fee or any sort of toll on the Strait of Hormuz, that means that they can't be sanctioned. You can't be exchanging with a sanctioned country, so that means that sanction is gone. It's off the table. I thought that was very interesting in terms of everything kind of opening back up. One thing that I did want to pull apart and see if you have any information on is, I believe I saw JD Vance talking about $300 billion in terms of possible investment for the reconstruction in Iran. I can see why the different factions would want to bid on the contracts and get that, but where would the money originally be coming from? Who would be funding the reconstruction in Iran, and necessarily why?
That is the big question. And that will determine who had the most leverage in this managed transition. So if Iran had all the leverage, then it would just fund it itself. To fund it itself, then it would need the other parts of the deal to come through, which is all of the sanction money to be returned.
Oh, yeah.
All of the shipment, fees on shipments. And the removal of sanctions. So those are the negotiation. All of these are financial negotiation. And this is why, effectively, this will offend a lot of people that are very pro-Iran, pro-resistance. And again, I always say this. I have my humanitarian hat, which I'm not talking with right now. And I have my analytical hat. My humanitarian hat cannot stand everything that my analytical hat is saying. But my analytical hat says, I don't care about what you want to happen. This is what is happening. And this is what's happening based upon the power dynamics. And the power dynamics is that I've always said there will be a Palestinian state, and it will be rebuilt by Gulf investment contracts. And China's probably the only one that has the capacity to actually build it with the Palestinians. And Iran, this was the friction, right? And this was, what is the mix that happens in the end? Are they autonomous? I personally believe that no, it won't be autonomous. But if the IRGC played their cards right, they could have got that to full autonomy. However, the problem is there was always a timeline in terms of the economic impact on the bond market. And so the bondholders were always saying, we can't have these bonds blow out unless we regime change the Fed. So you need Kevin Walsh, in there. You need QE in order to allow bonds to go out so that you can do yield curve control. And that was always the natural timeline that was here. Now, if China, in their negotiations with in the Beijing meeting, would have said Taiwan off limit, and we want to invest in Iran. We want the Middle East to be regionally stable, and we don't want the financial industrial complex getting its evil mitts where they have enough control over the region to destabilize it and hand it back over to Mick and go back to the forever war. And so China would have, in all of their agreements, said, we're going to be investing via this SPV or Cayman Island entity or Hong Kong company, whatever it may be. And the FIC would have said, all right, we'll go get Netanyahu to blow up Lebanon, kill more civilians, get a reaction, and that will give us more negotiation leverage. And so they would have been weaponizing death, destruction, massacre in order to get more leverage. China wants regional stability. And in Iran, with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, had a time frame, and the bond market was determining. So Trump was always trying to figure out, what do I need to say in order to get those yields back down and the price of oil back down?
38 times. It was 38 times that he pivoted.
Yeah, that was a combination of taco and insider trading. And I'm sure he was making shit tons of money. And remember, Trump had been bought by the Gulf countries via Affinity Partners, his venture capital fund, which was funded up to $5 billion, $2 billion of which came from Saudi. And so while everyone was focusing on APAC and Israel rules the world, there was a tiny little budget from APAC, a narrative that was we rule the world, while meanwhile there was billions in regional stability coming from the Gulf countries. And they'd already normalized with Iran, so they were all effectively on the same team, but they also have their own power struggle. So Iran wants to make sure that 300 billion is funded by itself. But the fact that they announced it, if it disappears, then Iran is going to be autonomous and will fund it itself. If it comes back as reparations, that's a lie. It's not reparations. It's going to be structured as a fund with investment contracts. And those investment contracts will reflect how much power the financial industrial complex managed to negotiate via using MIC to create as much death and destruction and seize as much land and the Greater Israel Project and all of that BS. And so MIC, they go and, Israel does all the death destruction. You got your plausible deniability story when you want to manage the creative divorce. It was them, it wasn't us, we were blackmailed, it was Epstein. Yep. And all of those are true, but it's not Israel, it's the MIC. Israel is a vassal of the MIC. If the 300 billion is predominantly China, then China had the real upper hand and gave concessions to FIC in their negotiations, which is the one world government technocratic AI partnership between China and the TIC, which is happening. That's the AI arms race we're led to believe, which has led to the stock market bubble. Because China can burst the bubble whenever they want, I said during our Dave Cullen interview.
Yep.
If the Gulf actually ends up with the most of the investment, and then you get a security pact between Iran, Saudi, Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan, then they had either Chinese shell companies in that construct, and so China obfuscated it via the region, but the region will have a degree of autonomy that means that they can control both the petrodollar and petro-yuan and the LNG dollar and the LNG yuan moving into this new model. And so I don't listen to anything the politicians say, any of the rhetoric. That's all BS for political reasons. I'll be analyzing what those contracts look like in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran, in the Gulf countries, and the hidden financial flows behind them. That will tell you what the next century looks like. That's the new world order right there. And so that's what we, that's what I'll be analyzing, and that money will tell you the real power dynamics and who's in charge here, or who's got more leverage than someone else. And if there's less and less FIC, it means that you have to have some FIC, because if you have no FIC, then you may get a situation where it returns to the forever war and Mick comes in and tries to do covert operations.
I was going to ask, was there any way that they could, let's assume that it was FIC at play, that they were in control, and that this is moving forward with the new multipolar setup. Is it possible for Mick, or would Mick at some point in time try and reassert itself? I'm thinking about even Netanyahu seemed to be barking a little bit at the end of the war there, that he was, I think, making threats that he wasn't going to adhere to the deal between the U.S. and Iran, that he doesn't take orders from the U.S. I believe is exactly what I saw. Is it possible that the Mick tries to reassert itself and kick things off again?
Yes, very possible. So this won't be smooth.
Okay.
But when FIC wants to exert dominance, it can. And so it can use Mick to make profit, sell more bombs, create more destruction, get more leverage, but it's always going to be bounded. And if Netanyahu goes off on his own path, then he'll be regime changed. And I think he's already negotiated his regime change. And that will lead into the political cycle, which starts in October, November in the case of Israel. Then you have midterms in the case of Trump. That's what keeps them on track. So they will try and leverage their own position, but they're ultimately subordinate in this power structure. And if they showed any type of autonomy, then they'd just be JFK'd at the extreme.
Okay. Yep. Nope, that makes sense. The other thing I wanted to quickly hit on, as we talked about it a few times as well, is that we had this giant acid strip of the middle class that was going on. It seems like they did a pretty good job. From your read on the situation, is the acid strip side of the operation moving basically money up the hierarchy to power? Has that completed? Is that done? Or is there still... I'm wondering if there might be another major event on the horizon, some sort of theatrics that requires, like, are we talking about like the AI bailouts, or if there's more to be on the watch for, that'll be trying to pull money away from those who don't really have the most of it?
Yeah, so I think we're done predominantly. There could be some drama, with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but look, I believe the MOU will be signed on Friday. If you look at this week, we got... what did we have on Monday? So Monday we had the G7 meeting.
Yeah.
What's come out of the G7 meeting? Trump exerting influence narrative over Netanyahu, saying you didn't need to kill that many people in Lebanon. The Hezbollah, yeah, they're that, but come on, there's better ways of dealing with Hezbollah. So Trump is now preparing for, he's been given permission. Netanyahu knows his future. We don't know it yet. But he's now allowed to say, by the way, I'm in charge at this stage. So he gets more and more of that narrative so that the magatards can think, oh, yeah, he was playing 5D chess. And that leads into and I believe this would have all been negotiated. Whenever you do an M&A deal, the communication strategy is always negotiated. You draft what people can say when they can say it. And most people think it's organic, but it's not.
Yeah.
So we had the G7 meeting, and that was all about Ukraine, Russia, energy crisis, Europe screwed, basically nothing new there. And Russia, Ukraine will continue. There's another $1 trillion for Mick to make in compensation. They're about to lose a load of money from the Middle Eastern forever war. They need to make all that money back from NATO and Europe, and they need the Russia, Ukraine thing to continue. And the other thing is, Trump showing I'm in charge by narrative. So all the clips are circulating, and everyone makes their own opinion about what that is. Then today, what did we got Fed tomorrow,
Kevin
right?
Warsh. Kevin Warsh, I think, is
tomorrow.
Today and tomorrow. Yep.
Yeah, so I think rates will remain unchanged. Oh, today we had Bank of Japan, so they raised their rates.
Yes, 1%, first time since 1995.
Absolutely. So that's breaking of the Japan carry trade. So the liquidity from Japan is going to dry up now. That free trade to invest in US stocks goes. The Bank of Japan and the Fed can rug pull the US whenever they want. And so they've got that trade going. So Japan's leaning more into Asia, decoupling bit by bit without a managed transition. Kevin Walsh, I think, is too soon. Probably nothing will happen tomorrow. Rates remain unchanged. If we get an increase in rate or a decrease in rate, that will definitely take the market by shock.
That's a major signal. Yeah, I think we'll be analyzing the transcripts for slight differences in the words used at the press releases, like just with a fine-tooth comb.
Yeah, so my forecast is unchanged. But if he does raise it, that could have serious impact on the AI trade and markets and everything. If he does raise it, and if he decreases it, I mean, basically that can pump or dump SpaceX from here.
Yeah.
And so SpaceX had a very smooth IPO. They're now trying to acquire companies using their money printer of the SpaceX ATM. They can now buy any company with the money that they printed from the huge valuation is holding. So that's a nice narrative. So really, the Federal Reserve sets the terms. So we had G7 Monday. We had Bank of Japan today. We got Federal Reserve tomorrow, which is the banks, the FIC. The FIC are the shareholders in the Fed. Kevin Walsh is just spokesperson, chairman for the banks, and the FOMC in the board. Friday, what have we got on Thursday is Bank of England.
Of course it is.
Yeah. So whether Bank of England hikes or remains, I think they'll probably remain. We've already had some hikes. And then Friday we have the alleged signing of the deal.
Yep.
And so if this deal is signed, which apparently it is signed, I think the all the agreements have been done other than any kind of derailing. But they've all left themselves a card, and that is Lebanon. Yeah. And so, anytime you want to derail it, IRGC can create action in the Strait of Hormuz, and Israel can create action in Lebanon.
Yep.
And those are really, if you want to derail, those are the two things to derail. But overall, we'll get to the deal. It will just change the terms slightly.
Well, I think it'd be very interesting if Israel did take action in Lebanon and then Iran chose not to derail the deal. I feel like that would be very informative.
Yeah, so they're going to keep us analyzing that. Look, my overarching theory is that eventually all of the resistance will slowly be integrated into the local political systems. So Houthis within Yemen, Hamas within Gaza, which will have a GCC-funded rebuild plan. Israel will be privatized more and more and more. UAE's been buying more and more deals in Israel. If you get I'm not sure if the Abraham Accords is dead or Trump tries to pull that one off again. But either way, it's just about buying Israeli assets. And so whoever joins Abraham Accords gets to buy Israeli assets. There's been a long-term privatization of Israel. More and more IPOs are happening later this year. That's FIC controlling Israel, basically.
Yeah.
And if UAE and all the other GCC countries get to co-invest, then they get to buy it. And I think that will be part of it. And if they buy it, they will regime change to a GCC-friendly leadership rather than a MIC-friendly leadership right now. That's transitioned to a FIC-friendly leadership. And then slowly over the next 5 years, I think you'll see a Palestinian majority. Something still needs to happen over West Bank because that's still illegally occupied. That might be a transition from a two-state solution to a one-state solution. But you still got that one to figure out. And within Lebanon, I expect this to kick off a process of Hezbollah being integrated into the Lebanese army and the Lebanese political system. And then in North Africa, those are GCC dominated. They would have Turkey, Egypt, Saudi, and UAE would have split those up and decided what they're doing there. But slowly, I'd expect in North Africa those conflicts to be resolved, and the American proxies and the European proxies like ISIS, Al Qaeda, M23, M13, SDF, and all these different proxies to slowly reintegrate into the region, and then all the civil unrest comes to the Western Hemisphere. Is the prediction there?
Okay, well, that's not necessarily the ending that I just gotta get out of Dodge. Apparently, everyone keeps telling me to leave Canada, and I feel like I absolutely must at one point in time. And I did want to hit on something specific regards to mentioning the G7 and the technical industrial complex as well. We talked a little bit about AI, but one thing that was on my radar recently, which seems to be moving both very quickly in both the UK and in Canada, is this push for digital ID verification. You can't have to be over 16 to be on social media. I was curious, in your view, if that is the tick imposing itself on these governments as well, or if it's perhaps unrelated.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So all the technology was tested in the Palestinian laboratory. What they rebuild in Palestine is what they would like to do around the world. That's the beta for all the technology that makes its way to our smartphones, that was originally innovated for killing people. And that's why Israel was there, to have plausible deniability, so that the MIT can test this technology, the TIC can test this technology in Africa and in the Middle East and in the war zones. Once it's sufficiently beta tested, it then gets acquired into companies like Apple, Microsoft, the Magnificent Seven. And then it gets deployed through false flag operations and false narratives across the West. We've always had Australia, UK, and Canada as the beta tests.
Yep.
It's always covertly done in America, through NSA operations. But then it becomes overt. And in order to go overt, you need false flags. So you need narratives like domestic terrorism, which is why you really manufacture immigration crisis, which is why you radicalize people into these different algorithms. But yeah, what we've got is the next phase. So what the Keir Starmer, who predominantly is I'd say more Mick and Fick funded. So, he's the one that pushes the whole with, apparently the Brits are still trying to save democracy by sending weapons to Ukraine so that they can cipher off money launder and prop up the stock markets. Apparently we're still trying to defend democracy there. So European Union, NATO, and UK are pushing out that BS. They'll do that till the last Ukrainian is dead. They don't care. Mick will just carry on. And the longer you believe that, the more you're supporting that. It's complete BS. And then on the TIC side, there's been a lot of funding of groups via Israel, like Tommy Robinson, and these different divide and conquer white nationalist movements, anti-immigration movements. Then the pro-Palestinian, then the Jews rule the world. Just real divide and conquer, all sorts of...
Just turn up the heat on everybody.
All sorts of craziness. As you're taking people deeper and deeper into poverty, which those that don't own the assets are going to get worse, they're going to get less and less benefits, because the end goal is a universal basic income. That's the end goal.
Yeah.
And the universal basic income is to supply enough money to those that are on the wrong side that don't own the assets, where they can still consume, to prop up the valuations of the AI stocks that control everything, the social credit scores, the artificial intelligence, the stable coins, and the central bank digital currencies. And so you can see the slow transition. So in UK, you had the ratcheting up of those narratives that led to the pre-crime arrest technology, where they were scraping all the social media in order to arrest people before they actually took the actions. And a lot of that was happening in Canada, UK, trucker style things, Australia, and UK. And these are the ones where you get the biggest, narratives around immigration. So you make people broke, and then you give them an other. And then once they got an other, they can say, the source of my problems is you, Keir Starmer, and you, the immigrants, when they just don't know Mick, Fick, and Tick are paying and in charge, and they're just serving their lobbies. And then the next one they did was, freedom of speech, not freedom of reach. They allow us all to talk online, but we're building our social credit score. You had Genius Act, Clarity Act, that is stable coins. European Union doing central bank digital currencies along line the China side. Then the next one you need everyone to be forced to give their data in order to use the internet. So you create a narrative around, we don't want our children consuming pornography.
It's always
every parent in the world will relate to that. Just like every person in 9/11 said, we got to get those terrorists after they blew up the World Trade Center. And so you just keep going with these different things. And now all of a sudden, we're protecting the children. But now, in order for anyone in the UK to use the internet, they need to either have a digital ID, or they need to verify and download an app in the UK and give all their data. That will eventually be integrated with their stablecoin or central bank digital currency, depending on the path for that country, which will then only be spent for national security and because of domestic terrorists, which will be false flag operations that they'll create. And if you don't create them, if they don't radicalize you enough so you create them, then they'll create them, the MI6, CIA, Mossad. If they get caught, it's the whole, Israel controls us, blackmail operation, plausible deniability. So the next thing is, and then you download the app, and then the app will say you cannot spend your money eventually unless you get this digital ID, and this makes up your digital ID. Eventually, then it will be saying in the energy crisis, we need you to compete with these AI data centers. So you get a tokenized carbon credit score. And you have to trade your ability to access this energy. And the World Economic Forum agenda, which is 100%, I know some of your other guests believe that Trump's fighting that. I mean, Trump has done more for the World Economic Forum agenda. But that's the uni party. I don't want to say, that I don't want to get in that left-right BS, because it's just complete BS at this point. They all get paid by Mick, Fick, and Tick, and they all serve certain allegiances more. And Trump has been Tick and Fick, transnational capital and the technical industrial complex, which is World Economic Forum, across that side. So you will own nothing and be happy. They're trying to do it with Bitcoin. We got strategy, we got Bitcoin treasury companies. We got centralizing as much Bitcoin as possible.
There was one I saw dropped yesterday. BlackRock launched iShares Bitcoin Premium Income ETF, BITA, looking at 15 to 25% annualized returns, which, man, it really feels like they're turning up the dial on the carrot to try and get you to part with your Bitcoin. Like, that seems, no offense, straight out of like Celsius or BlockFi. Like, we're going to give you 25% annual return. Get the fuck out of here. This is like this. What are your thoughts on that? Sorry, I just wanted to get that in there.
So to close that one anyway, yes, the digital ID that's agenda that they'll keep mission creeping and raising the bar. Yeah, on the Bitcoin side, they definitely don't want you to own Bitcoin. That's been my long-term thesis. Strategy is a vehicle for centralizing as much Bitcoin as possible. We've now got MSTR, which still has a Bitcoin premium, but the Bitcoin per share is constantly being diluted. So then they launched the corporate, the preference share, convertible equity. That pulled in the FIC into the convertible debt. And once that, debt instrument, we then got the next phase, which is the digital credit. Yeah. And digital credit, which is a preference share that has a dividend that can be ended if you don't want to sell the Bitcoin, do want to sell the Bitcoin. As it goes away from its $100, you increase the yield, decrease the yield. I mean, he's created the most amazing arbitrage vehicle for FIC. And so what does FIC do? FIC it launches the ETF, and now BlackRock launches the ETF Bitcoin Income. And so now they can create the covered calls, the derivative complex, receive income. And whenever Jane Street wants to manufacture a short-term crash in the price of Bitcoin, then you wrap Jack Mallers and Bitcoin-backed loans and Bitcoin conferences through David Bailey and Bitcoin hedge funds, or Strike and Bitcoin-backed loans and the Cantor Fitzgerald via 21 Capital. You know, you wrap as many of the ecosystem that you can reverse merger into a Bitcoin Treasury company. So then you can push narrative, you can push leverage, and the more goes into the ETF, the more it's subordinate to FIC. And so they have completely cornered the short-term price of Bitcoin to manipulate it. But their goal is to get your Bitcoin in custody. You know, you resist by holding it in self-custody and not leveraging it up. But that whole complex has been built, and it will get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're getting all these weird narratives now around the different types of Bitcoiners, or the different types. We got digital collateral, digital credit, digital money, digital, like, you know, all of these narrative creations in order to hide people from the obfuscation of self-custody Bitcoin into FIC. And yeah, you know, that will keep going. The financial engineering will keep going. Nothing stops that train. So you just need to recognize the game and understand how to have a strategy around it. And the strategy is they've got the short-term price. If they want to margin call you, if they want to engineer a short-term crash, then you just do these little tricks. We saw it. Michael Saylor says, I'm selling 32 Bitcoin, sells it at $77,000. The price crashes, buys back 1,500 Bitcoin at $1,500 Bitcoin at $65,000. Great trade. That dilutes the Bitcoin per share. So then the price of STRC corrects back down. Then you can either increase the yield or you arbitrage it back up. And Jane Street and all the other hedgies in the background, and Cantor brings more and more, tries to fool more and more people into reverse mergering their companies into the fold. You know, this is the game. That nothing stops this train. You just need to recognize it, and you turn all those people into subordinate FIC vehicles. Now suddenly Adam Back just promotes stable coins and all sorts of weird things like mining security tokens that have very questionable backgrounds. And you know, this is how you get people. You subordinate them. You invite them to islands. You know, you load them up with debt. You lever them up, and you incentivize them to put all of your assets into a FIC vehicle.
No, it's a very simple and very powerful and very helpful heuristic. Are they telling me to have Bitcoin in self-custody? No? Then be on alert. Then there's something else here at play. It really is just that. And the amount of people that I feel like, it's like they've talked themselves into overcomplicating something that's actually really quite simple, right? Just take the time to learn Bitcoin in self-custody. Don't lever it up. Don't try to play any fancy games with it. Everybody always gets in shit when they do. We've seen it happen again and again and again. And even right now, in what feels like the bottom of a bear market, the doldrums, the apathy has never been higher. It's like that's still just the right call, and you can see it. And you're starting to see more and more people talk about it, which I think is really important.
Yeah, here's the difference on this one, by the way. So before it was, you know, if you look at the background of SBF, he's applying for his pardon right now with the Trump administration. We'll see where that goes. But you know, on his board was Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell were the lawyers of CIA, Mossad, and MI6. So these are deep state operators. You know, he was connected via MIT. He's in the Peter Thiel Fellowship. Peter Thiel is the currency speculator with George Soros, you know, deeply connected into these deep state ops. He's all over the Epstein files, you know, was trying to confuse people into store of value versus median of exchange. And in one of our episodes before the Iran war, we did the whole deep dive into Peter Thiel and Epstein and when he tried to infiltrate Bitcoin. So SBF was connected that way. Alex Maszynski at Celsius, he was deeply connected via Daniel Leone. Daniel Leone has got an AI startup today. He's not in prison while Maszynski is. With the Prime Minister's Office of Israel. He is in Israel right now. The company that was hacked for a chunk of the ETH was owned predominantly by the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. The company that they acquired is an Israeli cybersecurity custody company. The wife of Daniel Leone was the IDF social media propagandist that was actually responsible for pushing out the story that UNRWA, the United Nations organization that was providing all the food to the Palestinians, was actually responsible for October the 7th that led to the starvation and famine campaign in Palestine. She was the head of VP of loans at Celsius.
Really?
Yes. So, this one was deep. We're also starting to see in this managed divorce with Israel, we're starting to see that much of the hacks that were traditionally blamed on Russia and North Korea seem to suddenly be Israel. Then I look back in history and wonder about things like the 119,000 hacked Bitcoin. And really, was that the person? Was it the crocodile of Wall Street that did that, Razakhan?
Yeah.
We know who her husband was connected to via their Ukraine networks. We know that a bunch of the money in FTX was connected to Ukrainian funding. And we know that where did all the laundering happen? It happened via the stablecoin networks that were built between Silvergate, Signature, Silicon Valley Bank, FTX, and Alameda, which was the technology that Silvergate purchased from the Libra project, which was Facebook.
Yep.
And so they had that network, which allowed for this facilitation of crime. And when we look back at it, who was it that rug pulled Silicon Valley Bank? It was when Peter Thiel came on Spaces and said, take your money out of Silicon Valley Bank. As a result of inflation is transitory after the Russia-Ukraine war. So call me a conspiracy theorist if you like, but it seems to always come back to the same players. And remember, that was the time that Peter Thiel was saying, I've sold all my Bitcoin and no one should be buying Bitcoin. Deeply integrated and connected into these infiltration networks. And so again, you can sit back and you can watch and what is that? That's the precursor. So when you took out Silicon Valley Bank, you then had the FTX bankruptcy, you then had the Celsius bankruptcy, you then had Voyager, you had Genesis, you had Gemini, you had all of those, the Barry Silbert network. Barry Silbert seemed to get away with everything. Alan Silbert, the brother of Barry Silbert that created INX, the security token exchange, a radical Zionist that I argued with many times. INX deeply connected to Israeli, ties in terms of, their founders and their team. So look back at these hacks. And I remember because I was deeply involved in the Bitfinex one and the Celsius one. We structured a recovery token for creditors. But I look back at all these events that seem unrelated, and suddenly, there definitely seem to be covert networks behind these hacks. And what was the result of the end of all of that deleveraging event? It was the banks that were approved. It was Trump coming in to create crypto capital and stablecoins and Genius Act. And it was BlackRock ETF. It was Michael Saylor's treasury companies. It was the copycat treasuries with the custodian of the bonds, which is Howard Lutnick and Cantor Fitzgerald. World Liberty Financial was what the money laundering organization for all these covert deals. And what did Trump do? He put his sons in charge, Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump. What did Steve Witkoff do? Handed over to his son. What did Howard Lutnick do? Handed over to the son. And so the next generation were doing these laundering operations. Apparently, if draining the swamp means handing over to the swamp, then Trump did an awesome job for Tick, Mick, and Fick. Everything makes sense if you can just recollaborate who Trump works for. If you think Trump works for the American people, then nothing makes sense. If you think he works for transnational capital with some compensation of wars for Mick, with an Orwellian technocratic governance structure for Tick, then Trump did everything he was paid to do. And the World Economic Forum will make sure that crypto is used so that they own the asset. You will own nothing. And how are they going to make you happy? Engineer a pump and dump in the AI bubble, which China can burst at any time, as we described in the last interview.
Yep. Through
the stock market, commodity market, or bond market. And what will they replace you with? A universal basic income. So they built all the layers. Maybe JD Vance is that guy, the Palantir's guy, Peter Thiel's guy. Maybe there's a regime change into the Democrat. It doesn't matter. They'll corner both sides to get the same agenda. But you will own nothing and be happy means, let me translate this for you. They custody, you leverage, you get the token, you get the Wall Street wrapper, the stock, the vehicle. And when they rug pull it from you, and you've got no Bitcoin in self-custody, they give you the universal basic income so that you are happy. And what would the universal basic income be? It will be just enough stable, programmatic, social credit score powered stablecoin that is spent into propping up the economy to concentrate more wealth into those that own the assets and those that own the AI at the end of this. And so I think where we came from this is there one more disaster?
Yeah.
I think the AI pump and dump is the next one. That will be just like the dot-com boom and bust. The second wave of investors, so the VCs and the private equity and the FIC and the IPO and the investment banks and the commercial banks, they just made all their money through the IPO. That's done.
Yeah.
Then you
got the they'll wait for the unlock period, and do you think they'll wait for Anthropic and OpenAI to go public as well?
I do, yes.
Okay.
So Trump his job is to do fiscal dominance. Kevin's wash is to facilitate that. This will lead to that ginormous pump that gets all the capex and malinvestment to build all this new AI infrastructure. But what's interesting about the AI infrastructure is it expires in 3 years. You need to reinvest again in 3 years with all the latest chips. Where's all that money coming from? And so the private credit market is the too big to fail. That's how you get your QE. And the justification for it is national security, because we don't want China to win the AI race.
Yeah. Which, by the way, you're already seeing in terms of like, I always feel like Canada's like the test bed for stuff. So not only we're getting like digital ID and under 16, and they're going to have either digital ID or like age estimation, or you got to upload your information, which is already terrible too. But Canada's now going down this AI for all route, which is just absolutely ridiculous. We don't have the money to actually fund the infrastructure, and they're shooting themselves in the foot the entire way, including people keep trying to fight data centers. But I just thought it was really interesting on that point that we're already seeing U.S. neighbor saying, hey, as a matter of our own security and interest, because we don't want to be reliant on the U.S., we now have to do the Canadian government AI plan. I feel like they're always testing here first before trying down south.
Yeah, the governments are going to be replaced with AI, and the AI is going to be controlled by those that own the assets, the infrastructure, the chips, the data centers, the rare earth minerals, and that is a partnership between the FIC and China, the FIC-TIC and China. That is what was the Beijing meeting. The Beijing meeting consisted of all those that control that AI control grid. And the second China wants to rug pull and reset the world order, they can just use the fact that they've got the gold and the West has the derivative contracts that are not backed by gold in the commodity market. They can sell their bonds to blow out the yields on the 30-year and 10-year, giving the justification for the Fed to print more money in order to get those yields back down, which means that the FIC gets the yield at the same time. China can just sell their bonds in order to do that, or Japan. Or they can do another DeepSeek moment and say, hey, by the way, all of that CapEx you just spent, you didn't need to spend it. Here's an infrastructure that doesn't require all of that. And by the way, you got to spend it again in 3 years. So they could rug pull the stock market. Not to say they will, but they can. And that's in partnership with FIC, and FIC will reposition. And so the moment, and remember, wasn't Trump meant to be taking on the Fed?
Yeah.
The Fed has the whole market cornered. If they increase rates or decrease rates, that tells the story of everything from here. The whole market has never been more sensitive to that.
Yep.
And if you want to bail it out, you bail it out with some stable coins, which helps the TIC agenda, the World Economic Forum agenda. And so now you have all the knobs and all the bits and bobs you need for the complete control by FIC and TIC. And Mick had to leave the Middle East, and they get Europe and Central and South America. And China gets to leverage that because FIC can't infiltrate China.
Yep.
And China knows that. This is why we have these capital controls and, making sure that no company is ever bigger than the Chinese government. Is a defense mechanism. I'm not saying you'd want to live there, but that's the strategy. That's how you stop the infiltration by FIC. The tokenization, the privatization, the securitization that leads to currency wars, installation, colored revolutions, regime changes, IMF debt dependencies, and the removal of all sovereign ability and dollarization of your economy.